There is a photograph taken somewhere in northern France in the autumn of 1944. It appears in several collections of wartime imagery without attracting much commentary. It shows three American infantrymen sitting against a stone wall. They are not wounded, they are not eating, they are not writing letters or cleaning weapons. Their faces hold an expression that everyone who has studied wartime photography eventually learns to recognize, and that no single word in English adequately names. Understanding how WWII soldiers managed exhaustion gives us a window into human resilience and adaptability. It shows us what people are capable of when they have no other choice. And surprisingly, many of the techniques they developed are still used today by modern militaries, emergency responders, and anyone else who needs to function at high levels despite severe sleep deprivation. Fact number 1. The moment a soldier first discovered that he could function while genuinely deeply exhausted was different for every man, and almost every veteran who was asked about it in later years remembered the precise occasion with a clarity that suggested it had been a genuine surprise, not a confirmation of something expected, but an encounter with an unexpected capacity of the self. For most, it arrived somewhere in the first weeks of sustained frontline service. The adrenaline of initial deployment had worn off. The reality of continuous operational tempo had not yet been absorbed as normal. A man who had been awake for 36 or 40 hours found himself, almost without deciding to, still doing what needed to be done, reading a map, answering an order, moving from one position to another with the necessary speed and direction. The body had simply refused to stop, and the self that inhabited the body had adapted to the refusal. The adaptation was not comfortable. It was not without cost. It would demand payment in full later, in ways that the young man against the stone wall in 1944 had not yet begun to calculate. But the discovery itself, the realization that the edge he had feared was not in fact the edge, was one that millions of soldiers made in the first weeks of genuine combat, and it changed permanently their understanding of what a human being could be asked to bear. Fact number 2. The physiological reality of acute sleep deprivation in a combat soldier was significantly more complex than any wartime medical document attempted to describe. The symptoms shifted in ways that depended on the interaction between sleep loss, physical exertion, nutrition, temperature, and the particular neurological demands of the task being performed. What the medical surveys of the period did capture was the rough progression. After 24 hours without sleep, reaction time slowed measurably and judgment under uncertainty began to degrade. After 36 hours, the capacity for complex planning deteriorated, emotional regulation became unreliable, and the brain began experiencing brief involuntary lapses, microsleeps of 2 to 10 seconds, that the person experiencing them was often entirely unaware of. After 48 hours, auditory and visual disturbances began appearing in otherwise healthy individuals, voices at the edge of hearing, movements in peripheral vision, the sense of a presence in empty ground. The Army's own medical research papers acknowledged these progressions with clinical precision. What they did not record was the soldier's subjective experience of them, the specific quality of still performing, still moving, still deciding, while the brain simultaneously produced experiences that bore no relationship to the external world. That particular form of double existence was something that a statistic could not hold. Fact number 3. The sleeping arrangements available to frontline infantry soldiers during sustained operations were so far from anything that peacetime concepts of rest described that veterans consistently reported difficulty, decades later, explaining them to people who had not shared the experience. In the foxhole system that characterized much of the fighting in both the European and Pacific theaters, 2 men typically occupied a single position. The understood agreement was that one slept while the other kept watch, in 2-hour rotations when discipline held, in shorter or more irregular patterns when it did not. The man sleeping was doing so on ground that was frequently wet, almost always hard, often cold, and occasionally being shelled. He was sleeping in his uniform and equipment, sometimes in his boots, sometimes with his weapon in his hands. He was sleeping with the knowledge that he would be woken within 2 hours and required to be immediately alert. And yet sleep came, not because the conditions were adequate, but because the body's need had grown larger than the obstacle. Veterans described learning, within the first weeks of frontline service, to fall asleep in seconds, to pass from full wakefulness to unconsciousness in the interval between lying down and completing the next thought. This capacity, acquired under duress and largely forgotten in peacetime, was one of the most remarkable adaptive skills the war produced. Fact number 4. The German Wehrmacht's use of Pervitin, the brand name under which methamphetamine was commercially available in Germany from 1938 during the campaigns of 1939 and 1940, represents one of the most thoroughly documented and least discussed pharmacological episodes of the Second World War. German military medical officers distributed the drug, initially without central coordination and later under formal requisition systems, to troops engaged in the invasions of Poland and France. The appeal was straightforward. Pervitin suppressed the need for sleep, elevated mood and confidence, and enabled soldiers to sustain physical activity across periods that would otherwise have required rest. The 9-day drive through the Ardennes in May 1940, during which German armored and infantry units covered distances that Allied planners had judged impossible in the available time, was accomplished partly on the suppressive effect of methamphetamine on the physical and psychological symptoms of exhaustion. The cost came afterward, in the crash that followed methamphetamine depletion, in the longer-term patterns of dependency and withdrawal that German military medical records began noting with alarm by 1941, at which point the Wehrmacht's drug procurement policies were significantly revised. Fact number 5. The Allied response to the discovery of German amphetamine use was both faster and more ambivalent than is commonly acknowledged. By 1940, the British Royal Air Force had begun issuing benzodrine, an amphetamine sulfate manufactured by Smith, Kline and French, to aircrew engaged in extended bombing and night fighter operations. The drug's utility for keeping pilots alert during missions lasting 8 to 12 hours was considered straightforward, and the medical case for its use was initially thought strong. The United States Army Air Forces adopted a similar policy. By the North African Campaign of 1942, benzodrine tablets were being distributed to ground troops engaged in extended operations, including British troops in the opening phases of El Alamein, where the drug was described as intended not only to maintain wakefulness but to sustain morale and resolve under fire. The ambivalence appeared in the medical literature relatively quickly. Military doctors began noting that benzodrine-assisted alertness was not the same as genuine rest, that the drug suppressed the subjective experience of fatigue without eliminating its physiological accumulation, and that soldiers who had performed well under its influence sometimes collapsed dramatically when its effects wore off. The tension between operational utility and medical concern about this distinction would run through Allied drug policy for the remainder of the war without ever being fully resolved. Fact number 6. The concept of forward psychiatry, treating combat exhaustion cases as close to the front as possible, with the explicit goal of returning men to their units rather than evacuating them to rear hospitals, was one of the most consequential institutional responses to the exhaustion problem that the Second World War produced, and it emerged from necessity rather than design. In the First World War, men who collapsed under the cumulative weight of sustained combat stress and sleep deprivation had typically been evacuated to base hospitals, where the distance from their units and the hospital environment made returning to duty psychologically difficult and statistically uncommon. WWII military psychiatrists advocated instead for treatment stations positioned near the front, where the core intervention was deceptively simple: sleep, food, warmth, and the categorical assurance from an authoritative figure that the man's collapse was a normal physiological response to abnormal conditions and that he would recover. The astonishing finding, documented in the wartime papers of psychiatrists like Roy Swank and W.A. Marchand, was that this minimal intervention returned approximately 40 to 60% of combat exhaustion cases to duty within 72 hours. The body's capacity for recovery given even minimal conditions of rest was as remarkable as its capacity for endurance. Fact number 7. The infantry soldier's relationship with food and its connection to the management of exhaustion was understood by experienced NCOs and officers with a practical sophistication that no formal nutrition science of the period could have predicted. Experienced sergeants knew, from observation refined across months of operations, that a man who had not eaten for 18 hours was not simply hungry, he was cognitively and emotionally compromised in ways that went well beyond the physical discomfort of an empty stomach. Blood sugar depletion interacted with sleep deprivation to produce a compound deterioration of judgment and emotional regulation that was significantly worse than either deficit in isolation. Units with experienced leadership therefore went to considerable lengths to ensure that men ate, even when appetite was suppressed by stress or exhaustion, even when the food available was cold, unappetizing, or of genuinely poor quality. Veterans recalled NCOs who circulated through positions during static periods specifically to ensure that men were eating, not as a welfare gesture but as a tactical calculation. A fed soldier was a more reliable soldier. And in an infantry unit where reliability was survival, the distribution of K rations in a foxhole at 2 in the morning was as operationally significant as any order issued by a commanding general. Fact number 8. The physical geography of exhaustion in the Pacific Theater differed from the European experience in ways that created specific challenges for the management of fatigue. Jungle operations in New Guinea, on Guadalcanal, in Burma, combined extreme heat and humidity with terrain that made every movement a significant physical effort. A man operating in a tropical jungle environment at temperatures above 90 degrees Fahrenheit might lose several liters of fluid through sweat in a single day's march, with salt and electrolyte losses that could produce heat exhaustion independently of any sleep deficit. The combination of heat, humidity, inadequate nutrition, disease burden, malaria, dengue fever, and scrub typhus affected frontline units in some Pacific campaigns at rates exceeding battle casualties, and continuous operational pressure produced a form of physical depletion that veterans consistently described as qualitatively different from European theater exhaustion. Several veterans who had served in both theaters noted that Pacific exhaustion felt total in a way that European exhaustion did not, a depletion of the entire body rather than simply the accumulation of sleeplessness. The medical records support this subjective impression, showing significantly higher rates of disease-related incapacity in Pacific formations than in comparable European ones. Fact number 9. One of the most effective informal methods that soldiers developed for managing the cognitive effects of extreme fatigue was the deliberate narrowing of attention to a single, immediate, achievable task. Paul Fussell, drawing on his own infantry experience and on a broad reading of combat memoir literature, described this as the soldier's essential cognitive adaptation, the replacement of long-range thinking with an exclusive focus on the next hour, the next position, the next meal, the next rotation of watch. Under normal circumstances, this kind of cognitive narrowing would represent a significant deficit, the inability to plan, to consider consequences, to maintain a broad situational picture. Under the conditions of sustained exhaustion and combat stress, it was a survival mechanism of genuine effectiveness. A man who was trying to think about whether the war would end, about what he would do when it did, about whether his father's health had improved, about whether the tactical situation 3 kilometers to his left was developing favorably. This man was distributing his limited cognitive resources across a range of problems, none of which he could currently affect. The man who had learned to think only about the next step, the next action, the next immediate requirement, was conserving those resources for the decisions that actually fell within his control. Veterans described acquiring this capacity not through instruction but through the gradual painful compression of mental horizon that sustained exhaustion imposed, until the horizon sat perhaps 6 hours ahead and no further. Fact number 10. The role of unit cohesion, the quality of the bonds between individual soldiers within a small fighting unit, in sustaining functioning under exhaustion has been documented in military social psychology with sufficient consistency to constitute something approaching a scientific finding. The landmark post-war study The American Soldier, compiled by Samuel Stouffer and his colleagues from surveys conducted during the war, found that soldiers consistently identified loyalty to their immediate companions as the primary motivation for continuing to function under conditions that would otherwise have produced collapse or desertion. Exhaustion tested this finding continuously. A man who had been awake for 40 hours and who could not remember clearly why any of the strategic objectives of the campaign mattered could still understand with perfect lucidity that the man in the adjacent foxhole depended on him to remain awake and alert. That specific local dependency, not patriotism, not ideology, not the abstract cause, was what held people functioning past the point at which individual motivation had been consumed by depletion. Veterans recalled it consistently. The reason they kept going in the moments when they had nothing left to keep going with was the face of the man next to them who also had nothing left, and who was also keeping going, and who would notice if they stopped. Fact number 11. The particular exhaustion experienced by combat medics and battalion surgeons occupies a specific corner of the wartime exhaustion literature that has received less attention than it deserves. Medical personnel in forward positions were subject to all the same sleep deprivation, physical depletion, and environmental stress as the infantry they served, with the additional burden of continuous emotional and cognitive demand that the treatment of casualties under fire imposed. A battalion surgeon working in a forward aid post during sustained operations might go 48 hours or more without sleep while performing procedures, wound debridement, plasma administration, triage decisions that required a level of technical precision and clinical judgment entirely incompatible with the physiological state the operator was actually in. The military medical literature documented this paradox without fully resolving it. The need was urgent and continuous. The personnel available were limited. The alternative to functioning while exhausted was not functioning at all, which meant men dying who might otherwise have been saved. Post-war studies of medical personnel noted significantly elevated rates of psychological disturbance compared to comparable non-medical military populations, a finding consistent with the specific compound of exhaustion and emotional exposure that frontline medical duty imposed, but one that was almost never framed in those terms at the time. Fact number 12. The infantry soldier's relationship with cigarettes as a fatigue management tool has been reduced in most historical accounts to a comment on wartime nicotine consumption, but the actual role that cigarettes played in the daily management of exhaustion was both more specific and more significant than that framing suggests. Nicotine's stimulant properties, its ability to temporarily elevate alertness and narrow attention, were well understood empirically by soldiers long before the pharmacological mechanism was formally described. A cigarette during a quiet watch period served not only as a brief sensory pleasure but as a genuine if modest cognitive intervention, a few minutes of slightly sharpened attention at a moment when the alternative was the slow slide toward microsleep. The distribution of cigarettes as part of the American C ration and K ration was not accidental. It reflected a practical military judgment that nicotine's effect on alertness had operational value. Veterans of Pacific Island campaigns recalled calculating their cigarette supply with the same care they gave to ammunition and water, not because they were addicted in the peacetime clinical sense, but because the cigarette served a functional purpose in the specific economy of a consciousness operating at its lower margins. That specific use, the cigarette as a tool for managing the boundary between wakefulness and collapse, is not the story that post-war tobacco history has told. Fact number 13. The phenomenon that military doctors during the Second World War called the 1,000-yard stare, a fixed, unfocused gaze directed at nothing in the middle distance, accompanied by an apparent disconnection from the immediate environment, was in its initial stages a symptom of extreme exhaustion before it became in its later stages a symptom of psychological breakdown. The distinction was clinically important and practically difficult to make. A man who had been awake for 36 hours and was sitting quietly, apparently staring at nothing, might be in the early stage of a protective cognitive withdrawal, a kind of spontaneous pause that the brain performs when it has been oversaturated with sensory and emotional input, from which he would emerge with somewhat restored capacity after a period of rest. The same external presentation in a man who had been cycling through this state repeatedly for weeks, in whom the withdrawal had deepened and lengthened and from whom genuine emotional contact had receded, was something qualitatively different, the beginning of the combat exhaustion breakdown that would require clinical intervention. Field commanders and experienced NCOs learned to make this distinction through observation rather than training, developing an informal diagnostic competence for the specific look of a man who needed rest versus the specific look of a man who needed a doctor, a competence that no manual described and no curriculum taught. Fact number 14. The management of the standing watch, the 1 to 2 hour period during which a soldier was required to remain alert and observant while his comrades slept, was in the context of sustained exhaustion, a task of considerable psychological difficulty. Its informal solutions were as creative as any tactical improvisation the war produced. The primary problem was simple. A man who had been awake for 20 or more hours, positioned in a static foxhole with limited sensory stimulus and no immediate physical activity, was fighting the strongest biological drive the human organism produces after hunger and thirst. Several informal techniques circulated between units, transmitted by word of mouth and practical demonstration rather than by any formal instruction. One was the practice of standing rather than sitting during watch, not because standing improved visual acuity, but because the physical discomfort of standing engaged the body's alertness responses in a way that sitting did not. Another was the deliberate management of cold. A man who was uncomfortably cold was unlikely to fall asleep, and some soldiers actively avoided wrapping themselves too warmly during watch periods for precisely this reason. A third, recorded in several memoirs, was the practice of maintaining a running internal monologue, a continuous low-level narration of everything visible and audible in the immediate environment, that kept the verbal centers of the brain engaged and therefore, its practitioners believed, kept the entire brain more reliably awake. Whether the last technique actually worked physiologically is less interesting than the fact that men invented it independently, in multiple theaters, under the same pressure. Fact number 15. The Eastern Front produced conditions of sustained exhaustion that exceeded in duration and severity almost anything experienced in the Western Allied theaters, and the coping methods developed by German and Soviet soldiers under those conditions reflect the particular extremity of the environment. German infantrymen during the Russian winters of 1941–42 and 1942–43 were operating in temperatures that fell below -30 degrees Celsius, in conditions of logistical failure that meant inadequate food, clothing, and equipment, and simultaneously under operational pressure that precluded the rotation policies that might have provided relief. Soviet soldiers, whose conditions were in many respects equally severe, had the additional dimension of a political system that classified failure to function as a potential act of sabotage rather than a medical condition, creating an incentive structure for continuing to perform under exhaustion that was, to say the least, coercive. What both sets of combatants demonstrate is the extreme upper boundary of human functioning under sustained depletion. Operations conducted for weeks at a time with minimal sleep, in lethal cold, with inadequate nutrition, under continuous threat. The physiological and psychological cost was catastrophic in both armies, visible in casualty statistics that attribute a significant proportion of losses to non-battle causes, including the collapse of bodies that had simply been used beyond the point of recovery. Fact number 16. Among the informal cognitive strategies that soldiers developed for managing exhaustion, one of the least discussed but most widely practiced was the deliberate use of memory as a kind of mental furniture, a means of occupying the mind during the static, featureless periods of sustained watch or extended travel that were simultaneously the most boring and the most dangerous moments for the management of fatigue. A soldier who had learned during idle garrison periods to rehearse in detail the layout of his hometown, the sequence of streets from his house to his school, the specific arrangement of a familiar room, the physical routine of a normal morning, had a private mental program that could be run during the dead hours of a night watch with sufficient cognitive engagement to maintain wakefulness without requiring external stimulus. Veterans recalled these internal rehearsals with remarkable precision decades later, sometimes recovering details of their childhood environments that they had not consciously thought of since, details that had been deposited in long-term memory by the repeated, attentive rehearsal of years of wartime watch. The irony is not lost. The war, which destroyed so much, also preserved, in some of the men who survived it, an unusually detailed and permanent archive of the world they had left behind. Fact number 17. The point at which physical exhaustion crossed into what military medicine termed combat exhaustion, the clinical entity that represented the breakdown of functioning rather than merely its degradation, was not a fixed threshold but a zone of interaction between physical depletion and accumulated psychological stress. Roy Swank's 1946 paper in the American Journal of Psychiatry, based on observations of American infantry in the European theater, proposed that the average soldier could sustain effective combat functioning for approximately 200 to 240 days of frontline service before the cumulative weight of exhaustion, fear, loss, and sustained stress produced a psychiatric breakdown that was not simply a matter of more sleep. Swank's essential finding, that psychological breakdown under sustained combat stress was not a sign of individual weakness but a predictable biological response to a sufficient dose of specific experience, was one of the most important contributions of wartime psychiatry to the understanding of human limits. The finding did not, in most formations, translate into rotation policies adequate to prevent exhaustion-induced breakdown, because the operational requirements of the war consistently outran the manpower available to implement them. but it provided the conceptual foundation for treating the men who collapsed with something other than contempt. Fact number 18. The role of music in managing the subjective experience of exhaustion, specifically, the informal singing and humming that occurred in units during rest periods and quiet marches, has been almost entirely overlooked in the serious historical literature on wartime fatigue, perhaps because it sounds too anecdotal to be taken seriously as a functional mechanism, and yet the reports of it are consistent enough, and the physiological rationale plausible enough, to warrant attention. Soldiers in transit, on troop ships, in trucks, in columns, were observed by officers and medical personnel to be significantly more alert and responsive after periods of collective singing than before them, an observation consistent with current understanding of music's effect on the arousal systems of the brain. The songs themselves were not primarily patriotic or martial. Veterans recalled a preference for familiar popular songs, hymns and comic songs whose words were known well enough to engage the verbal memory automatically, freeing attention from the internal drift towards sleep that characterized the exhausted brain in motion. Several memoirs describe NCOs who specifically initiated singing during long marches as a deliberate tactic for maintaining the unit's alertness and pace, not because any manual instructed them to, but because they had observed the effect and had the practical intelligence to use what worked. Fact number 19. The particular exhaustion of the airborne soldier, paratrooper or glider infantry deserves specific attention because it combined the standard elements of infantry exhaustion with an additional physiological dimension unique to the method of deployment. Men who had jumped or landed in darkness, often scattered from their intended drop zones, had typically been awake for 12 to 20 hours before landing. They had experienced the acute adrenaline surge of the jump itself, and then they found themselves required to move immediately to tactical objectives in unfamiliar terrain without the benefit of the unit coherence that conventional infantry could at least attempt to maintain. The adrenal response to the jump provided a brief period of physiological alertness that veterans consistently described as startling in its clarity, a sharpening of perception and a suppression of the subjective sense of fatigue that lasted in most accounts for 2 to 4 hours after landing. What came afterward, when the adrenaline exhausted itself and the accumulated pre-jump sleep debt reasserted itself against the demands of the ongoing operation, was described by many airborne veterans as among the most difficult physical experiences of their service. The specific crash of an adrenally depleted body into the full weight of 30 or more hours of combined sleep deprivation and physical exertion, in an environment that simultaneously demanded maximum alertness and offered no means of rest. Fact number 20. The officer's experience of exhaustion differed from the enlisted soldiers in a specific way that has received insufficient attention in the historical literature. It was compounded by the continuous requirement to maintain the appearance of functioning more effectively than the men who were watching. An officer who was visibly as exhausted as his men had, in effect, relinquished one of the primary tools of his leadership, the transmitted confidence that came from observing a more senior person whose composure suggested that the situation was manageable. Experienced officers understood this implicitly. Many of them described in memoirs and oral histories a specific daily discipline of self-presentation under exhaustion that cost more energy than it conserved, the deliberate maintenance of a voice that sounded steady, a face that expressed something other than the blankness of depletion, a posture that did not confirm what the body was experiencing. Several officers noted that this performance became paradoxically easier as exhaustion deepened. Somewhere past 48 hours of continuous wakefulness, the emotional machinery that produced anxiety about how one appeared ceased to function, leaving a kind of flat, effectless calm that read to observers as composure, a misreading that served its purpose, and that the officer in question was usually too tired to correct. Fact number 21. The specific role of humor in managing exhaustion within wartime units is better documented than many of the informal coping mechanisms in this series, partly because it was visible enough to be recorded by observers, journalists, officers, military social researchers who were present in the field. What the observers noted, and what Samuel Stuffer's post-war surveys confirmed, was that the quality and frequency of unit humor was one of the most reliable indicators of a formation's functional state. Units that laughed were units that were coping, and units that had gone silent were units approaching the limit. The humor itself was, by peacetime standards, often dark to the point of apparent callousness. Jokes about death, about wounds, about the probability of survival. Veterans were unanimous in rejecting the interpretation that this represented moral deterioration. The dark joke served a specific psychological purpose. It named the thing that could not otherwise be named, allowed the emotional charge of extreme fear and fatigue to discharge through the relatively safe channel of laughter, and confirmed between men sharing it that they were still recognizably the same people who had found things funny before the war. As long as a man could laugh, he was still there. When the laughter stopped, something more serious than exhaustion was underway. Fact number 22. The American Army's rotation policy, the theoretical system by which frontline units were to be periodically relieved and given rest periods, was one of the most widely discussed and most inconsistently implemented welfare provisions of the entire war. In principle, the policy recognized that sustained frontline service without relief produced cumulative exhaustion that eventually reduced a unit's combat effectiveness to near zero, and that rest and recovery were therefore operational requirements rather than simply humane ones. In practice, the policy was continuously subordinated to the immediate demands of ongoing operations. The relieving unit was not available. The tactical situation precluded withdrawal. The operational tempo was too high to permit the pause. The consequence, documented extensively in the Army's own post-war histories, was that certain formations, particularly those engaged in the prolonged attritional fighting of Italy and the Pacific Island campaigns, spent periods of 3 to 6 months in continuous frontline service with minimal rotation, producing the cumulative exhaustion loads that Roy Swank's research had identified as sufficient to cause universal psychiatric breakdown. The soldiers in those formations were not exceptionally resilient. They were simply not given the alternative that the Army's own doctrine said they required, and they functioned, or failed to function, within the reality that policy produced. Fact number 23. The Ardennes campaign of the winter of 1944-45, the Battle of the Bulge, produced a concentration of exhaustion variables that military historians have acknowledged in aggregate but rarely examined at the level of individual experience. American units that had already sustained weeks or months of operations in the autumn fighting found themselves, in mid-December, in the middle of a major German offensive conducted in some of the worst weather conditions of the European War. Temperatures dropped to -20 degrees Celsius in some areas. Resupply was severely disrupted. Units that had expected rotation received instead emergency orders to hold positions. The men who fought the Bulge did so in a physiological state that by any clinical measure should have precluded effective functioning, severely sleep-deprived, inadequately clothed, nutritionally deficient, and operating equipment that the cold itself had compromised. The fact that they held, and eventually counterattacked, is one of the most studied episodes of wartime human performance. What is less studied is the specific, daily, hour-by-hour process by which individual soldiers maintained the minimum required functioning in those conditions, the specific decisions, adaptations and mutual dependencies that kept a frozen, depleted, outnumbered force coherent enough to do what it did. Fact number 24. The experience of the bomber crew, specifically the heavy bomber crews of the RAF Bomber Command and the United States Army Air Forces, represents a form of sustained exhaustion that was distinct from infantry exhaustion in its temporal structure and its particular psychological character. A bomber mission over Germany typically lasted 8 to 12 hours, conducted at altitude in temperatures well below freezing, in an aircraft being actively shot at for significant portions of the flight, with duties, navigation, bomb aiming, gunnery, engineering management, that required continuous technical attention and periodic bursts of absolute cognitive precision. The men performing these duties were typically in their early 20s and had received their assignments after training periods too short, by pre-war standards, to be considered adequate, between missions which might recur every 2 or 3 days depending on weather and operational tempo. Aircrew were theoretically resting in relatively comfortable rear echelon billets. The rest was in practice inadequate for recovery from the specific combination of cold exposure, altitude hypoxia, fear, and technical exertion that each mission imposed. The psychological dimension was unique. Unlike the infantry soldier, whose threat was continuous and whose death, if it came, would typically come quickly, the bomber crew member knew with statistical precision, the loss rate figures were informally but accurately known to every airman, that each mission incrementally increased the probability of a death that, when it came, would typically be violent and aerially catastrophic. Fact number 25. The practice of what veterans called soldier sleep. the ability to fall into genuine unconsciousness in any available moment of relative safety, regardless of duration, position, or ambient noise, was one of the most practically important adaptive skills of the entire war, and it was one that most combat soldiers acquired not through training but through the simple biological pressure of acute need. The military sleep method that circulated informally through Allied forces, a progressive relaxation technique that began with the face and jaw, worked through the shoulders and limbs, and ended with a brief visualization intended to clear the working mind, was codified in a 1942 U.S. Navy pre-flight school manual, and reportedly enabled some practitioners to fall asleep within 2 minutes in field conditions. Whether the specific technique was responsible for the rapid sleep onset that veterans described, or whether the more straightforward explanation, that men who are genuinely exhausted fall asleep quickly because the physiological pressure is simply overwhelming, is perhaps less important than the fact that the capacity was real and was acquired. The soldier who could sleep for 20 minutes in the back of a truck, on a grassy verge during a column halt, sitting against a wall while his officer conferred with a map. This soldier was managing his exhaustion budget with a competence that had direct survival value, and his ability to do so was not a sign of indifference to his circumstances but of an intelligent adaptation to them. Fact number 26. The neurological and physiological literature on what sustained sleep deprivation actually does to the decision-making apparatus of the human brain was not in any rigorous sense available to WWII military planners. The systematic study of sleep deprivation's cognitive effects would not reach institutional prominence until the work of William Dement and colleagues in the 1950s and 1960s, but the practical knowledge of its effects was already embedded in military culture through observation and experience, and it surfaces repeatedly in the training literature and leadership manuals of the period in the form of implicit acknowledgments that tired men made worse decisions. The specific vulnerability that sleep deprivation creates in decision-making is now well characterized. It impairs the prefrontal cortex's ability to evaluate risk accurately, producing a systematic tendency to underestimate hazards and to prefer options that offer immediate reward over options that require delayed gratification. For a soldier deciding whether to cross an open space quickly rather than going the long way round, or whether to stay awake through another watch rotation rather than waking his companion, or whether a movement in the darkness ahead was worth the noise of a warning. These tendencies toward optimistic risk assessment in conditions of exhaustion had consequences that were measured, though never recognized as such, in casualty statistics. Fact number 27. The specific experience of sustained exhaustion in the naval service, aboard convoy escort vessels, submarines, and the landing craft of amphibious operations, has its own characteristics that differ significantly from either the infantry or the aircrew experience, and that have been less thoroughly examined. Sailors on convoy escort duty in the North Atlantic during the peak submarine campaign years of 1942 and 1943 stood watch rotations that in continuous operational conditions could reduce available sleep to 4 hours in 24, and those 4 hours were subject to interruption by submarine contacts, weather emergencies, and the demands of damage control. The psychological dimension was specific to the maritime environment, unlike the infantry soldier, whose immediate environment was visible and whose threat, when it appeared, was at least perceptible. The submarine threat was entirely invisible and could materialize without warning. This produced a particular form of sustained vigilance that sailors described as physically expensive in a way that ordinary wakefulness was not. A continuous sensory scanning that maintained the nervous system in a mild but persistent state of heightened arousal across watch periods and often into the rest periods that were supposed to allow recovery. Men who were technically off watch and theoretically resting, but who could hear the continuous sound of a vessel underway in submarine-infested waters, were not resting in any physiologically useful sense. Fact number 28. The Army's formal recognition, late in the war, that exhaustion was a medical condition rather than a moral failing represented one of the most significant institutional shifts of the entire wartime period, and its practical consequences were substantial. General George Patton's public berating of 2 combat exhaustion cases in Sicilian hospitals in August 1943, incidents that became a significant political scandal when reported in the American press, was in retrospect the most visible collision between the old institutional attitude toward exhaustion and the new medical understanding that the war was generating. Patton's position, that exhaustion cases were cowards who were letting their comrades down, reflected a genuine cultural norm of the period, one that was widely shared among senior officers and that the army had not yet formally repudiated. The aftermath of the Patton incident, which included his formal reprimand and temporary removal from command, accelerated the Army's institutional movement toward the forward psychiatry model and toward treatment policies that assumed exhaustion was a real physiological condition requiring medical management. The shift was incomplete. Stigma attached to combat exhaustion throughout the war and long after it, but the direction was clear, and the practical consequence was that a significant number of men received treatment rather than punishment for a condition that, in a different institutional environment, would have destroyed them entirely. Fact number 29. The phenomenon of automaticity, the tendency of deeply exhausted individuals to continue performing habitual actions without conscious initiation or monitoring, was something that wartime soldiers described with a mixture of gratitude and unease that the psychological literature of the period did not have adequate language to address. A man who had been awake for 40 hours and who was marching along a familiar road would sometimes find, becoming aware in a moment of slightly increased alertness, that he had covered the last several hundred meters with no recollection of covering them, that his legs had been performing the march while his conscious awareness had been elsewhere, or nowhere in particular. The same phenomenon occurred in more operationally critical contexts. A soldier performing a repetitive tactical task might find himself executing the next step before the conscious decision to execute it had registered. In conditions where the habitual action was correct and the environment matched the trained pattern, this automaticity was genuinely useful, maintaining performance at a level that conscious, exhausted deliberation could not have matched. In conditions where the environment had changed and the habitual response was wrong, where the road turned unexpectedly, where the building layout differed from the expected pattern, the same automaticity was potentially fatal. Veterans recalled specific near misses attributable to exhausted automatic behavior with a vividness that made the gratitude and the unease entirely comprehensible. Fact number 30. Among the coping mechanisms available to soldiers managing sustained exhaustion, the maintenance of small fixed daily rituals, the morning shave, the systematic polishing of specific items, the habitual order in which equipment was checked before movement, served a function that was simultaneously practical and psychological. The practical function was straightforward. A man who checked his equipment in the same order every time was less likely, under exhaustion, to omit a check that a variable routine might have allowed him to skip. The psychological function was subtler, and by the testimony of veterans, equally important. The ritual anchored identity, and provided a brief daily experience of agency and completeness in an environment that systematically denied both. A shaved face was not a tactical asset. It was a statement, addressed primarily to the self, that the person performing the shave was still the person who had performed it before the war, that the standards of that person still applied, that the degradation of the environment had not yet extended inside the boundaries of the self. Several veterans described maintaining these rituals past the point where they made any logistical sense, continuing to shave with a small amount of cold water in conditions where infection risk made any unclean cut dangerous, continuing to arrange their kit in the prescribed order when there was almost nothing left to arrange, because to abandon the ritual was to abandon something about themselves that they were not ready to release. Fact number 31. The relationship between leadership quality and the management of unit-level exhaustion was one of the clearest findings of wartime social psychology, and it surfaces consistently in both the formal literature and the memoir accounts. Samuel Stuffers, the American soldier, found that soldiers' assessment of their immediate officers and NCOs, specifically their competence, their genuine concern for their men's welfare, and their willingness to share the hardships they imposed, was one of the strongest predictors of a unit's resilience under sustained operational stress, including exhaustion. The mechanism was not purely emotional. A competent officer rotated watches intelligently, ensured that food reached men who might otherwise not eat, identified the early signs of exhaustion-driven breakdown and acted on them before they became casualties, and managed the operational tempo of his unit to preserve some minimum of rest even when the situation was pressing. An incompetent or indifferent officer did none of these things, and the men under him experienced identical objective conditions as significantly more depleting than men whose officers were managing the exhaustion burden actively. The margin between these two leadership types, expressed in the functioning capacity of the men they led, was not trivial. Units with effective exhaustion management consistently outperformed equivalently depleted units with poor management, and the difference showed up in casualty rates, mission completion, and psychiatric casualty proportions over sustained operational periods. Fact number 32. The specific vulnerability of the newly arrived replacement soldier, the man who joined a combat unit as an individual replacement after significant casualties, had reduced its strength to the exhaustion-related breakdown that threatened all frontline soldiers was significantly greater than that of men who had been with the unit longer, and the reason reveals something important about the psychology of sustained functioning. An established soldier, however exhausted, was functioning within a web of interpersonal knowledge. He knew which man was reliable in a crisis and which would need steadying, which sergeant's judgment to trust and which to verify, which specific physical details of their current environment represented actual versus imagined threats. This knowledge had been accumulated across weeks or months of shared experience, and it provided a cognitive scaffold that reduced the load on individual decision-making, a form of distributed intelligence that allowed each member of the unit to function more effectively than they could have functioned alone. The replacement soldier arrived without any of this scaffold, required to build it from scratch while simultaneously managing the exhaustion and fear of frontline service. In a unit whose established members, aware of the statistical probability that replacements were casualties in waiting, were often reluctant to invest emotional energy in new relationships that history had taught them were likely to be brief. Fact number 33. The problem of falling asleep on sentry duty was, for the wartime military, both a disciplinary matter and a physiological reality whose interaction produced one of the most morally uncomfortable zones of the entire wartime experience. The legal framework was unambiguous. Sleeping on sentry duty was a serious military offense, punishable in some jurisdictions by death, on the grounds that a sleeping sentry endangered the lives of every soldier in the position he was supposed to be protecting. The physiological reality was equally unambiguous. A man who had been awake for 36 hours in cold conditions, with inadequate food and continuous background stress, stationed in a static position with limited sensory stimulus, was being required by his duty to overcome one of the most powerful drives the human brain produces. The collision between these two realities produced outcomes that ranged from formal court-martial to informal arrangements whereby comrades watched each other as carefully as they watched the enemy, quietly waking anyone whose chin had begun to drop before any officer noticed. The informal arrangements were far more common, and they represented the practical moral intelligence of men who understood that their comrade's lapse was less a failure of character than evidence of a shared condition, and who preferred to solve the problem quietly rather than hand it to a justice system whose remedies were disproportionate to the reality it was addressing. Fact number 34. The Pacific Island campaigns, Guadalcanal, Peleliu, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, produced documented instances of exhaustion-driven functioning that stand as benchmarks of what the human body can be required to do. The Marine Corps' assault on Peleliu in September and October 1944, originally estimated as a 3-day operation, lasted 73 days. The island's terrain, razor-sharp coral ridges, a network of mutually supporting caves, temperatures consistently above 90 degrees Fahrenheit, combined with the ferocity of the Japanese defense to produce attrition rates and fatigue loads that exceeded almost anything in the Pacific War. The 1st Marine Division sustained casualties approaching 40% before being relieved, and the men who remained were by any clinical measure operating in a state of profound physical and psychological depletion. Veterans of Peleliu described the final weeks of the operation in terms that recur consistently across oral histories and memoirs: the narrowing of consciousness to the next immediate problem, the cessation of any emotional response to events that would earlier have been overwhelming, the performance of complex physical tasks, scaling ridges under fire, evacuating casualties, maintaining fire discipline, from a psychological space that had been stripped of everything except the immediate operational necessity. Whether this represents human resilience or human endurance pushed to its absolute limit is a question that Peleliu's survivors, in the testimony they left, did not attempt to resolve. Fact number 35. The medical concept of accumulated fatigue debt. The physiological principle that sleep deprivation accumulates in the body in a way that cannot be fully addressed by a single night's rest, and that the recovery of full cognitive and physical function requires an extended period of adequate sleep across multiple nights, was not formally understood by wartime military medicine in the terms that modern sleep science would use, but its practical reality was observed and noted in the field. Military psychiatrists and medical officers documented the finding, with some surprise, that soldiers returned to duty after 48 hours of rest at a forward treatment station were not, in any measurable sense, as fully recovered as they appeared. Their subjective sense of improvement was real, but their cognitive testing performance lagged behind it, and their emotional resilience was demonstrably lower than it had been before the accumulation of their fatigue debt had begun. The practical implication, that the recovery time required after sustained exhaustion was significantly longer than the operational situation typically allowed, was one that the Army's manpower situation during continuous operations almost never permitted it to act on. Men were returned to duty when they reported feeling better, not when they were fully recovered. And the next cycle of depletion began from a baseline that was already below normal. Fact number 36. The experience of the military nurse, specifically the nurses serving in field hospitals and evacuation hospitals within range of combat operations, represents yet another distinct variant of wartime exhaustion that has been insufficiently examined in the broader literature. Nurses in forward medical facilities worked shifts of 12 hours or more, under conditions that combined the physical demands of sustained activity with the emotional demands of continuous exposure to severe casualties. The specific challenge of nursing exhaustion was the impossibility of the emotional withdrawal that the work required. Unlike the infantry soldier who could manage his emotional exposure through the numbness that extreme exhaustion eventually produced, the nurse's work required her to remain emotionally present, to speak, to reassure, to comfort, in circumstances that demanded everything the exhaustion had removed. Several nurses' memoirs from the period describe a daily negotiation between the professional requirement of emotional engagement and the personal cost of maintaining it, the deliberate daily reconstruction of the emotional capacity that the previous day had depleted, the sustained effort of presence in a context that continuously demanded it, the discovery that presence was possible even when nothing behind it remained except the will to provide it. Fact number 37. The specific ways in which extreme exhaustion altered the sensory experience of the battlefield, the changes in perception, in the salience of stimuli, in the interpretation of ambiguous sensory information, are described with remarkable consistency across memoirs from multiple theaters and multiple nations, suggesting that these alterations are predictable features of the profoundly sleep-deprived brain rather than individual idiosyncrasies. Sound changed in quality and apparent distance. Familiar noises, the specific acoustic signature of a German rifle, the particular sound of a mortar leaving its tube, lost the automatic categorical clarity they normally carried and became objects of explicit, effortful interpretation. Color vision degraded subtly, with many veterans noting that prolonged exhaustion produced a slight desaturation of the visual field, as if the world had been turned down by a fraction of its normal vividness. Depth perception became unreliable in ways that veterans described as intermittent rather than continuous, a moment of normal visual clarity followed by a period of uncertain distance assessment, followed by normal clarity again. These perceptual alterations were not hallucinations. They were the predictable degradation of a sensory processing system operating with insufficient neurological resources, and the veterans who described them were describing without knowing the neurological vocabulary. The specific ways in which a sleep-deprived brain begins to conserve the resources it has left by reducing the precision of the processes it runs. Fact number 38. The German Wehrmachter's experience with Pervitin addiction among combat soldiers became sufficiently serious by 1941 that the Army High Command issued formal restrictions on its distribution and use, limiting the drug to specific operational circumstances under medical supervision. The restrictions were unevenly enforced, partly because the drug remained commercially available in Germany until 1941, and partly because the informal distribution channels that had grown up in frontline units were not easily controlled by headquarters directives. What the Wehrmacht's experience with Pervitin illustrated, and what the Allied experience with benzodrine partially confirmed, was the fundamental pharmacological trap of stimulant-assisted exhaustion management. The drug suppressed the subjective sense of fatigue without eliminating its physiological accumulation, creating the dangerous illusion of reserves that did not exist. A soldier who had been awake for 60 hours and had taken Pervitin at the 36th hour might feel alert enough to function effectively, while his body was accumulating a sleep debt and metabolic deficit that the drug had simply hidden from his subjective awareness. When the drug wore off, typically 12 to 16 hours after administration. The hidden deficit reasserted itself with compound interest, producing a crash that was in some respects more dangerous than the original exhaustion because it arrived suddenly and without warning. Fact number 39. The discovery that certain soldiers appeared to function significantly better under exhaustion than others, maintaining judgment, emotional regulation, and physical performance at levels that their objective sleep deficit should have precluded, was observed by military commanders throughout the war and was studied, with limited success, by military psychologists attempting to identify the characteristics that predicted exhaustion resilience. The findings converged on one consistent finding that has since been substantially confirmed by neuroscience. Individual variation in resilience to sleep deprivation is real, large, and not reliably predicted by most of the variables that military selection processes measured. Some people are genuinely more resistant to the cognitive effects of sleep deprivation than others, and the difference is substantial enough to be operationally significant. The best performing sleepy individual outperforms the average performing sleepy individual by margins that matter in a combat context. What the wartime studies could not tell their authors, because the neuroscience did not yet exist, was that this variation is largely genetically determined, is stable across an individual's life, and is entirely unrelated to character, courage, or any of the other morally laden qualities through which the military of the period tended to interpret performance under stress. Fact number 40. The specific daily cost of maintaining functional performance under sustained exhaustion was something that soldiers paid in ways that only became visible after the war ended. The evidence appears in the post-war health records of veterans, in the psychiatric literature of the late 1940s and 1950s, and in the oral testimonies of men who had for years after their return experienced the deferred consequences of physiological reserves spent during the war and never fully replaced. Sleep disorders were among the most common and most persistent. Veterans reported difficulty falling asleep, early morning waking, nightmares vivid enough to interrupt sleep regularly, and a chronic background fatigue that distinguished their post-war sleep from anything they had experienced before the war. Research conducted on veterans in the 1950s found significantly elevated rates of cardiovascular disease, immune dysfunction, and metabolic disorders compared to non-veteran cohorts matched for age, social class, and baseline health. Findings consistent with the known long-term effects of sustained sleep deprivation and chronic stress exposure on the physiological systems that regulate those conditions. The war that they had survived with such remarkable functional adequacy was still doing its work in their bodies, quietly and continuously, long after the fighting had stopped. Fact number 41. The Italian campaign, fought up the length of the Italian peninsula from September 1943 to May 1945 in terrain that was, from the perspective of exhaustion management, among the most punishing of any theater, produced a specific form of attritional exhaustion that veterans consistently described as different in character from the exhaustion of fast-moving operations. In the slow, grinding advance up the spine of Italy, where each German defensive line had to be fought through at considerable cost in time, lives, and physical effort, and where the next line was always visible from the crest of the current one, the fundamental psychology of sustained functioning underwent a specific distortion. The endpoint that soldiers used to anchor their functioning, the rotation that was coming, the objective that would end this phase, the leave that had been promised, receded continuously as each apparent finishing point revealed another beginning. Veterans of Italy described the particular despair of this experience with unusual consistency. Not the despair of a man who has given up, but the despair of a man who keeps going despite the evidence because he has no alternative, and because keeping going has become so automatic that not keeping going would require more effort than continuing does. This particular quality, the exhaustion not of depletion but of repetition without end, was among the subtlest and most demoralizing forms the war produced. Fact number 42. The capacity that experienced combat soldiers developed for what might be called tactical sleep allocation, the ability to assess the current situation's safety margin and calibrate the depth of their sleep accordingly, is described in enough accounts to suggest it was a genuinely acquired skill rather than merely a feature of individual constitution. A man who had spent months in the field described an ability to sleep in one of two modes: the light, monitored sleep of an animal in a hostile environment, from which any relevant stimulus, a human sound, a change in ambient noise, The specific silence that preceded enemy movement would immediately wake him, and the deep resource-recovering sleep of genuine rest, which could be entered only when he had assessed the situation as sufficiently secure to permit the lowering of the nervous system's surveillance threshold. The ability to modulate between these two modes, to know, in the moment between lying down and losing consciousness, which mode was appropriate to the current circumstances, was not something that pre-war civilian life had required or provided. It was a capacity formed entirely by the specific demands of the environment, in the same way that many of the other functional adaptations in this series were formed by the simple biological necessity of surviving in conditions that required skills the peacetime world had never requested. Fact number 43. The relationship between physical cold and the management of exhaustion was one of the most practically important and least theoretically understood aspects of winter warfare that military medicine grappled with throughout the war. Cold in moderate quantities acted as a stimulant to alertness in much the same way that discomfort acts as a stimulant. It gave the nervous system something to respond to that competed with the drive towards sleep. Veterans who had spent nights in foxholes in the Ardennes or on the Italian heights in January described how the cold that should have been simply another form of misery served, paradoxically, to prevent the deepest and most dangerous forms of exhaustion-induced collapse, because a body that was struggling to maintain its core temperature was a body that could not fully surrender to sleep. The dark corollary was the specific danger of the soldier who was so exhausted that cold had ceased to provide this stimulus, who had gone beyond the point where physical discomfort could maintain alertness, and whose body had begun the dangerous reduction of peripheral circulation and core temperature that characterized the early stages of hypothermia. In that state, the sleep that threatened was not the restorative sleep of rest but the lethal sleep of hypothermic shutdown, and the two were, in the field and without equipment, almost impossible to distinguish until it was too late to intervene. Fact number 44. The long-term legacy of wartime exhaustion in the bodies and behaviors of veterans was, for many decades after the war's end, almost entirely unacknowledged by the institutional systems, medical, welfare, governmental, that were responsible for their care. The PTSD diagnosis that gradually achieved clinical and institutional recognition from the 1970s onward addressed some of the psychological consequences of combat stress, but it did not specifically address the physiological legacy of sustained sleep deprivation, which operates through different mechanisms and produces a different constellation of long-term effects. Veterans who reported persistent fatigue, sleep disruption, and the chronic low energy state that many described as their baseline physical experience after the war were typically assessed in terms of their psychological condition rather than their physiological one, on the assumption that the body, having survived, had recovered. The assumption was not well founded. The science of sleep deprivation's long-term effects on the cardiovascular system, the immune system, and the metabolic regulatory systems was not sufficiently developed until the 1990s and 2000s to provide the conceptual framework for understanding what the wartime cohort's bodies had experienced and retained. By the time the framework existed, most of the men who had inhabited those bodies had already died, carrying the evidence of their war's physiological cost with them into graves that kept no records. Fact number 45. The specific adaptation that soldiers made in their cognitive strategy under extreme exhaustion, the shift from complex analytical reasoning to pattern matching and heuristic shortcuts, was functionally intelligent in ways that deserve more credit than the language of degraded performance typically allows. When a profoundly sleep-deprived brain abandons the slow, resource-intensive analytical processes of the prefrontal cortex and shifts toward the faster, more energy-efficient pattern-matching functions of deeper neural systems, it is not simply failing. It is selecting a different operating mode that in the right circumstances is genuinely effective. A soldier who had spent months in a specific environment had accumulated a vast library of environmental patterns whose recognition required no analytical processing. The way a particular landscape looked before enemy movement, the specific quality of a silence that differed from safe silence, the subtle change in a comrade's posture that preceded a particular kind of difficulty. The exhausted brain's preference for pattern recognition over analysis was, in an environment whose patterns had been deeply learned, actually an efficient use of available resources. The danger appeared when the environment changed in ways that invalidated the learned patterns, when the enemy adopted new tactics, when the terrain was unfamiliar, when circumstances required exactly the analytical flexibility that exhaustion had traded away. In those moments, efficiency became a liability, and the men who were most thoroughly exhausted were the least able to recognize that their most reliable cognitive tool had stopped working. Fact number 46. The experience of liberation from exhaustion, the specific physiological and psychological experience of genuine, extended rest after a sustained period of depletion, was described by veterans with a vividness and precision that suggests it was among the most intense physical experiences of their lives. Men rotated to rear areas after extended frontline service described the first 24 to 48 hours of genuine sleep as an experience qualitatively unlike ordinary rest, a descent into unconsciousness so deep that external stimuli, artillery in the distance, vehicles passing, voices, failed to penetrate it at all. The sleep lasted, in some accounts, for 16 to 18 hours at a stretch, and when it ended, the waking was not the gradual emergence of normal morning consciousness but a sudden, almost violent transition to full alertness that left the woken man briefly disoriented, unable to immediately locate himself in time or geography. Several veterans described, in the days following this initial recovery sleep, a quality of sensory experience, food tasting more intensely, light appearing more vivid, the temperature of a warm room registering with almost painful pleasure, that they attributed to the restoration of neurological systems that exhaustion had suppressed. Whether this represents neurological recovery or simply the contrast between profound deprivation and its relief is less interesting than the consistency with which veterans identified the first genuine rest after sustained exhaustion as one of the most memorable physical experiences of their lives, which says something precise, if oblique, about how complete the preceding depletion had been. Fact number 47. The particular challenge of sustained exhaustion for soldiers who held command responsibility, from squad leaders upward, was that their exhaustion had consequences not only for themselves but for the men under their command, and this knowledge was itself a source of additional strain that compounded the exhaustion it accompanied. A private soldier who was too tired to think clearly was primarily a danger to himself. A platoon commander who was too tired to think clearly was a danger to the 20 or 30 men who depended on the quality of his decisions. This asymmetry was understood by experienced officers and NCOs, and it produced in many of them a specific and exhausting vigilance about their own cognitive state, a continuous self-monitoring for the signs of fatigue-induced degradation, and an anxiety about making decisions from a state they could not fully assess. Veterans who had held command recalled this double burden, managing their own exhaustion while simultaneously managing its concealment from their men, whose functioning depended partly on confidence in their leadership, and whose confidence would have been eroded by accurate knowledge of how depleted that leadership's cognitive resources actually were. The specific courage required to continue making decisions in full awareness that one's decision-making capacity was compromised was, by any assessment, among the most difficult forms of wartime functioning that the conflict produced. Fact number 48. The Japanese experience of managing extreme exhaustion during Pacific Island defenses produced a specific institutional response that differed fundamentally from Allied approaches, and whose consequences were catastrophic in ways that the difference in assumptions made predictable. The Japanese military's conceptual framework for managing combat stress and exhaustion drew heavily on cultural traditions that identified physical endurance and the subordination of individual need to collective obligation as positive values, and physical complaint as a form of weakness or disloyalty. Soldiers who reported exhaustion to their immediate superiors in a context that carried those cultural expectations were typically refused relief and required to continue functioning. The practical consequence was not, as the framework assumed, the activation of additional reserves through willpower. It was the accelerated deterioration of units whose members were denied the minimum physiological recovery that would have partially restored their functioning capacity. The extraordinarily high Japanese casualty rates in Pacific Island defenses, often exceeding 95% of the defending garrison, cannot be attributed solely to the numerical and material superiority of American forces. They reflect in part the specific cost of a doctrine that required men to function past the point where functioning was biologically possible, and that provided no institutional mechanism for the recovery of the minimum resources on which continued functioning depended. Fact number 49. The problem of exhaustion-induced errors in communication, the specific category of mistakes that arose when profoundly tired soldiers misheard, misread, or simply failed to transmit orders and reports accurately, was one of the most persistent and least discussed operational hazards of the entire war. Military communication chains, under combat conditions, relied on a sequence of human actors, radio operators, runners, telephone personnel, the officers who relayed orders verbally, each of whom might be operating on severely limited sleep. A misheard grid reference, a transposed figure in a target coordinate, a message relayed with a single incorrect word. Under the right conditions, any of these could produce friendly fire incidents, failed reliefs, or coordinated actions that arrived at the wrong time or place. Several post-operation analyses of major engagements identified communication errors as contributing factors in outcomes that had initially been attributed to enemy action or tactical misjudgment, and some of those communication errors, when traced back through the chain, could be attributed to individuals who were at the relevant moment operating in states of demonstrable sleep deprivation. The wartime archives contain these analyses, typically in the measured language of after-action reports. What they cannot contain is the specific quality of a man's consciousness at the moment he wrote down the wrong number, or failed to ask for a repetition of the order he had not quite heard, or passed on something he had understood imperfectly because asking for clarification required a precision of attention that he no longer had. Fact number 50. The wartime generation's relationship with exhaustion did not end when the war did. Veterans returned to civilian life carrying in many cases a permanently altered relationship with sleep and rest that their families, employers and doctors rarely understood, and that the veterans themselves rarely discussed. Some had acquired the soldier's ability to fall asleep instantly in any circumstances, and retained it for the rest of their lives, waking their families with the speed and completeness of their transitions, sleeping through stimuli that kept others awake. Others had acquired the light, monitored soldiers' sleep and found that it persisted into peacetime, sleeping shallowly, waking at slight sounds, unable to achieve the deep rest that their bodies required. Still others had accumulated a sleep debt across years of wartime service that expressed itself, in the post-war decades, as a chronic fatigue whose origins no peacetime physician was equipped to diagnose. Because the concept of long-term fatigue debt and its physiological consequences was not yet available in clinical medicine, and because the veterans who experienced it had long since learned not to draw attention to the things about themselves that the war had changed. The exhaustion of the Second World War did not respect the armistice. It lived on in the bodies of the people who had managed it, in forms that those people carried quietly into the rest of their lives. Fact number 51. Among the most counterintuitive findings that emerged from wartime psychological research on exhaustion was the observation that soldiers in some of the most objectively depleted conditions reported, intermittently, experiences of unusual clarity and heightened sensory awareness that seemed entirely at odds with the degraded functioning that sleep science would predict. These episodes, described variously as moments of sudden lucidity, of extraordinary perceptual sharpness, of the world briefly becoming more real rather than less, were observed in soldiers who had been awake for 36 hours or more, typically during moments of acute operational demand. The physiological mechanism most likely responsible is the stress hormone response. Under conditions of acute threat, even a profoundly sleep-deprived brain receives a surge of adrenaline and cortisol that temporarily restores some of the alertness functions that exhaustion has degraded. But the subjective quality of the experience, as veterans described it, exceeded what a simple stress response would explain. A brief window of almost preternatural perception in the middle of profound depletion, followed by its closure and the return of the grey opacity that chronic exhaustion produced. Veterans recalled them with the particular precision of experiences that had been qualitatively different from everything around them, and they represent one of the most intriguing and least investigated phenomena of the entire wartime exhaustion literature. Fact number 52. The specific daily discipline of maintaining personal hygiene under conditions of profound exhaustion, continuing to shave, to wash available skin, to care for the feet that were the infantry soldiers' fundamental operational equipment, served a function that was simultaneously medical, psychological, and social, and that experienced NCOs enforced with an insistence that puzzled observers who did not understand all three dimensions. The medical case was straightforward. In the field conditions of most theaters, failure to attend to personal hygiene produced skin infections, trench foot and oral hygiene problems that could generate casualties independent of enemy action, and casualty prevention was an operational requirement. The psychological case was the one this series has returned to repeatedly. The maintenance of bodily standards asserted the persistence of a self that the environment was attempting to dissolve, and that assertion had genuine stabilizing effects on the consciousness of the man performing it. The social case was perhaps the most underappreciated. A unit in which men maintained their personal standards was a unit that had not yet crossed the threshold into the collective deterioration that preceded psychiatric breakdown, and the observable maintenance of those standards by each member provided the others with evidence that the threshold had not yet been reached. The morning shave was in this sense not merely a personal discipline but a form of social communication, a daily demonstration visible to every member of the unit that the collective was still functioning. Fact number 53. The Normandy campaign of the summer of 1944, particularly its attritional phase in the bocage country of northern France between June and August, produced a documented concentration of exhaustion that military historians have acknowledged in aggregate but rarely examined at the level of individual experience. The bocage, a landscape of small fields separated by dense earthen hedgerows that had been farmed for centuries and that provided excellent defensive cover for the defending Germans and almost none for the attacking Americans and British, produced a form of grinding, incremental fighting in which progress was measured in tens of meters per day. The psychological weight of continuous exposure to fire, without either the relative clarity of open country maneuver or the social support of static defensive positions, was particularly corrosive. Veterans of the bocage recalled a specific quality of fatigue unlike what they had experienced in training or in the immediate post-D-Day fighting, a bone-deep weariness that accumulated not only from physical exertion and sleep deprivation but from the constant, low-level drain of sustained vigilance in a landscape where every hedgerow concealed a potential ambush, and where the next 50 meters of advance required the same complete mental mobilization as the first 50. The Army's rotation policy, already inadequate for steady-state operations, was essentially suspended during the Normandy fighting, and the consequences were visible in the psychiatric casualty rates that spiked during August 1944. Fact number 54. The role of written communication, specifically the letter home and, in some units, the personal diary, in managing the psychological dimensions of exhaustion deserves attention as a daily coping practice whose specific functional value has been underestimated. The act of writing, even briefly, required the author to organize experience into language, and this organization imposed a minimal narrative structure on what was otherwise an undifferentiated accumulation of sensation, fear, physical discomfort, and confusion. A man who had spent 20 hours in a foxhole without sleep, listening to sounds he could not identify, and managing a fear that had no specific object, and who then spent 15 minutes writing a letter home in which he described what he had experienced in terms that another person could understand. This man had, in the act of writing, performed a rudimentary cognitive processing of the day's experience that the exhaustion would otherwise have left unprocessed. Military psychiatrists studying combat fatigue noted, without always understanding the mechanism, that soldiers who wrote regularly showed somewhat lower rates of the specific emotional and cognitive symptoms associated with accumulated unprocessed stress, a finding consistent with what contemporary trauma psychology now understands about the function of narrative in the processing of overwhelming experience. The letter home was doing work that neither the sender nor the recipient necessarily recognized, and it was doing it daily, in the minutes before sleep, in conditions that made the physical act of writing difficult and the cognitive act of composing a sentence a genuine effort. Fact number 55. The management of fear under conditions of sustained exhaustion was a specific challenge that the two conditions interacted to make worse in a mathematically compounding way. Fear, by its neurobiological nature, activates arousal systems that compete with sleep. A person who is frightened cannot easily sleep, and the evolutionary logic behind this is straightforward. A soldier who was chronically sleep-deprived and chronically afraid was therefore caught in a physiological trap. The fear prevented the sleep that would have partially restored his capacity to manage the fear, while the sleep deprivation lowered his capacity for the emotional regulation that might have reduced the fear's intensity. Experienced soldiers developed various informal strategies for managing this interaction, most of them directed at the fear end of the equation rather than the sleep end, because the circumstances that produced fear were often impossible to alter while a rest position, however imperfect, was at least potentially available. The strategies ranged from the straightforwardly cognitive, the deliberate rehearsal of statistical arguments for survival, the reminder that fear was normal and that fear alone would not kill a person, to the social, using the presence and calm of companions as evidence that the immediate situation was manageable, to the physical, using fatigue itself as an ally in the sense that a body sufficiently exhausted would eventually sleep regardless of what the mind was doing. The last strategy had the perverse quality of requiring more exhaustion to implement, which is why it was a strategy of last resort rather than first choice. Fact number 56. The specific experience of combat-related exhaustion differed between different national armies in ways that reflected not only the objective conditions of each army's operational environment, but the institutional and cultural frameworks within which exhaustion was interpreted and managed. The British Army's approach to combat exhaustion, shaped by the WWII experience and by the development of forward psychiatry in the North African campaign, was significantly more medically sophisticated by 1943 than either the American or German approaches, a sophistication that expressed itself in lower per-unit psychiatric casualty rates in some comparative analyses of the Italian and Northwest European campaigns. The Red Army's approach, driven partly by ideology and partly by the genuine absence of the manpower reserves that would have been required for systematic rotation, was essentially to continue until the individual broke or the operation ended, whichever came first, a policy whose human cost is visible in the staggering Soviet casualties of the Eastern Front, but whose operational consequences were, paradoxically, consistent with the Red Army's operational effectiveness in the war's later stages. The comparison is uncomfortable, and the ethical dimensions of it are not simple, but it illustrates something important about the relationship between institutional attitude and the practical management of the exhaustion that total war inevitably produces. Fact number 57. The practice of deliberately inducing controlled physical discomfort as a means of maintaining alertness during critical watch periods, standing in cold water, pressing a sharp object against the wrist, deliberately adopting uncomfortable postures, was described by enough veterans across enough different units to suggest it was an independently arrived at solution to a universal problem rather than the product of any single military tradition. The physiological logic was the same in each case. Pain signals arriving at the brain competed with the drive towards sleep by activating arousal pathways that the drive was attempting to suppress. The intensity of discomfort required to maintain alertness was roughly calibrated in the accounts veterans gave to the depth of exhaustion. A man who had been awake for 18 hours might be maintained by mild cold exposure, while a man at 30 hours needed something more aggressive to achieve the same effect. The methods were not pleasant. Veterans described them with the pragmatic distaste of people who had used unpleasant tools because no better ones were available. Not with pride, not with complaint, but with the flat acknowledgement that the alternative to maintaining alertness was the potential death of everyone in the position, which made the question of discomfort relatively easy to resolve. Fact number 58. The wartime archives of military psychiatry contain, among their more formally structured records, a scattering of individual case notes whose human specificity makes them among the most revealing documents in the entire literature of wartime exhaustion. A note from a forward treatment station in Italy in 1944 describes a soldier who, when asked on intake what he most needed, answered without hesitation, "A cup of tea and someone to talk to who is not afraid." A note from a Pacific Theater treatment facility in 1943 describes a Marine who slept for 17 consecutive hours, woke asking what time it was, and on being told went immediately back to sleep for another 9. A note from a British clearing station in North Africa describes a soldier who, given 48 hours of rest and regular food, recovered functional competence in a clinical assessment to a degree that left the examining psychiatrist noting, with a kind of professional surprise, that the case represented a straightforward exhaustion with no psychiatric complication. A diagnosis whose very ordinariness was, in the context of the cases surrounding it, its most remarkable feature. These notes, filed and forgotten in the archives of military medicine, are the closest the institutional record comes to the actual texture of what wartime exhaustion felt like from the inside. They are worth reading slowly. Fact number 59. The specifically visual character of combat exhaustion's effect on the infantryman, the way extreme fatigue altered not just the capacity for vision but its quality and its relationship to attention, shaped the battlefield in ways that commanders rarely accounted for, and that contributed to engagements whose outcomes were attributed to other causes. At the level of the individual soldier, the most practically dangerous visual effect of sustained sleep deprivation was not the hallucination, vivid and dramatic as the accounts of hallucinated enemies and phantom friends are, but the more mundane and continuous degradation of the automatic attention direction system that ordinarily orients the eyes toward movement, irregularity and novelty in the visual field. A well-rested soldier scanning a tree line would have his attention automatically drawn to the slight movement, the shadow that did not match the surrounding shadows, the irregular geometry of a concealed position. A soldier at 40 hours of wakefulness had degraded that automatic system. His eyes were still open, his attention was nominally directed toward the tree line, but the mechanism that would have flagged the anomaly was operating at reduced sensitivity. The man who died because he was looking and not seeing was, in the statistical analysis of casualties, simply a man who had been shot. The specific physiological reason that he had been looking and not seeing was not a variable that any casualty report recorded. Fact number 60. The relationship between the management of exhaustion and the quality of what soldiers ate, not simply the quantity of calories available, but the specific composition and temperature of their food, was understood intuitively by experienced field cooks and mess sergeants in ways that formal military nutrition science had not yet articulated. Carbohydrate-rich meals, delivered hot, had a specific and observable effect on a unit that had been operating in cold conditions. The rapid glucose availability calmed the metabolic stress of cold exposure. The warmth of the food raised core temperature and reduced the physiological cost of thermoregulation, and the social dimension of a shared hot meal provided a brief, coherent experience of normality that had genuine psychological stabilizing effects. Experienced mess NCOs in European theater formations went to considerable lengths to deliver hot food to forward positions, sometimes under fire because they had learned through observation that no nutrition textbook had guided, that the functional effect of a hot meal on a cold, exhausted infantry unit was operationally significant in ways that a cold ration, however calorically identical, did not replicate. The difference between a unit that had eaten hot and a unit that had eaten cold was not invisible to a good sergeant, and the lengths those sergeants went to in order to deliver the former reflected a practical knowledge that deserves more recognition than the kitchen records of the Second World War have typically attracted. Fact number 61. The long night marches that characterized much of the infantry experience across all theaters, the column movement conducted in darkness to avoid aerial observation, covering 10 to 15 miles over difficult terrain before dawn, produced a specific form of ambulatory exhaustion that veterans described as unlike any other experience of the war. Men marching in complete darkness, maintaining contact with the soldier ahead through touch or the slight variation in air movement created by another body, were in a sensory environment that provided almost no stimulus to support alertness. The march itself was a sufficiently automatic motor activity that it could continue long after the conscious brain had effectively disengaged. Veterans recalled specific instances of waking during marches, becoming suddenly aware of their surroundings in the middle of a column that had not stopped, without being able to identify when awareness had lapsed or for how long. The sound of the march, the rhythmic compression of boots on ground, the subtle percussion of equipment against body, became for many soldiers a sound that could be followed in a state that was neither fully awake nor fully asleep, navigating by sound and proprioception while the cognitive systems that would ordinarily have been managing the experience had temporarily stood down. It was perhaps the purest example of the functional automaticity that wartime exhaustion could produce, the body marching while the mind was somewhere else entirely. Fact number 62. The question of what happens to a person's sense of time under conditions of profound exhaustion, specifically, the specific distortions of temporal perception that sustained sleep deprivation produces, was one that wartime soldiers described with enough consistency to suggest it was a universal feature of the experience rather than an individual peculiarity. Under severe sleep deprivation, the brain's timekeeping mechanisms become unreliable in ways that affect both the estimation of elapsed time and the orientation to time of day. Veterans described days that had lasted subjectively for several days, nights that compressed into what felt like minutes, the loss of the automatic sense of morning that normally restores temporal orientation on waking, replaced in its place by a formless grey in which the question of what time it was had to be answered by looking at a watch rather than by consulting any internal sense. The specific disorientation this produced in the context of military operations, where timing was frequently critical, and where the failure to be in a specific place at a specific time could have catastrophic consequences, required men to compensate for a failed internal clock by externalizing the timekeeping function entirely, relying on watches, the positions of celestial bodies, and the testimony of companions whose own timekeeping might be equally unreliable. The systems worked imperfectly most of the time. The times they did not work are recorded obliquely in after-action reports that note units arriving late to objectives without accounting for the specific physiological reason that their sense of the correct time had become an unreliable guide. Fact number 63. The observation that soldiers who were most effectively managing sustained exhaustion tended to be those who had reduced their expectations of comfort and rest to the absolute minimum required for continued functioning, and who had done so without resentment and without a continuous mental expenditure of comparing their present reality to a preferred alternative, was noted by several wartime psychologists and military observers without being fully theorized. The mechanism is in retrospect recognizable. The person who maintains a gap between what is and what they wish were is expending cognitive and emotional resources in the maintenance of that gap. The person who has accepted what is and has calibrated their needs to what is actually available is not spending those resources on comparison and complaint. They are available for other uses. This cognitive economy, achieved through acceptance that was not passivity but a deliberate reallocation of mental resources from the management of disappointment to the management of immediate necessity, was described by veterans who had achieved it as a form of peace within the exhaustion rather than a cessation of it. They were not less tired. They were simply not adding the burden of preferring things to be otherwise to the burden of the things that were. Whether this constitutes wisdom, adaptation, or simply the depletion of the emotional resources that would otherwise have been needed for the preference is a question that the veterans who described the state did not typically attempt to answer. Fact number 64. A specific contribution of alcohol to the management of wartime exhaustion presents a complication that military historians have tended either to ignore or to frame too simply. Alcohol was widely available to soldiers in rear areas across almost all theaters. The British rum ration had a formal institutional history. The American Army relied more on informal access, and captured German and Italian supply stocks provided both sides with irregular supplementation. The physiological relationship between alcohol and exhaustion is not straightforward. Alcohol in moderate quantities can reduce the subjective intensity of anxiety and tension that sustain unwanted alertness, and thereby facilitate the onset of sleep. But it reduces sleep quality significantly, decreasing the proportion of restorative deep sleep and increasing the likelihood of early waking. A soldier who drank moderately before sleeping might fall asleep faster but wake less restored than one who had managed to sleep without alcohol. A distinction that mattered enormously when the next period of demanding performance was only a few hours away. Experienced soldiers appeared, from oral testimony, to have learned this distinction empirically, distinguishing between the drink that helped them get to sleep when anxiety would otherwise have prevented it, and the drink that was simply a drink, and calibrating their use accordingly. Whether this empirical calibration consistently translated into better sleep management than no alcohol at all is not a question the wartime records can answer. Fact number 65. The role of anticipation, specifically the forward-looking structure of hope, in sustaining functioning under exhaustion has been noted in the wartime psychiatric literature, but its specific mechanisms deserve more careful examination than they have typically received. Men who had something concrete to anticipate, a confirmed leave date, a scheduled rotation, a specific objective whose achievement would mark a clear end to a particular phase of the operation, functioned better under equivalent levels of exhaustion than men for whom the endpoint was indeterminate. The psychological mechanism is related to the one discussed in the context of cognitive narrowing. Anticipation gives the exhausted consciousness a point ahead of its current position that it can organize its effort around, reducing the formless quality of endurance without end that was among the most demoralizing features of prolonged operational stress. The practical implication that maintaining realistic, specific, time-bounded promises of relief to soldiers in sustained operations had genuine operational value was understood by the best field commanders, who went to considerable lengths to ensure that rotation schedules once promised were kept. The commanders who consistently failed to keep such promises, who moved promised rotation dates forward, or cancelled confirmed leave at short notice, paid for this practice in unit morale and eventually in the psychiatric casualty rates that reflected a formation that had lost the forward-looking structure on which sustained functioning partly depended. Fact number 66. The management of exhaustion in submarines, specifically the crews of Allied and German U-boats operating across extended patrols of 3 to 8 weeks in conditions of continuous threat, confined space, and disrupted sleep rhythm, represents one of the most extreme exhaustion environments of the entire war, and one of the least studied in the general literature. Submarine patrol watches ran on a rhythm that bore little relationship to any natural light-dark cycle, with 3 watch systems that rotated through the 24 hours in patterns that prevented the synchronization of sleep with any consistent external signal. The confined quarters, the continuous noise of machinery, the omnipresent threat of depth charging, and the specific psychological weight of extended submergence combined to produce a form of exhaustion that was as much neurological as physical. German U-boat commanders' logs from the Battle of the Atlantic period are marked by a systematic deterioration of entry length, prose quality, and observed detail across the second half of extended patrols, a deterioration visible to any reader who examines the logs sequentially. It was an inadvertent record of an exhausted brain's reduced capacity for the work of observation and language, a record that the log's own author was unaware he was documenting. Fact number 67. The particular courage required to make a command decision while fully aware of one's own exhaustion-induced cognitive impairment, to choose an action course while simultaneously knowing that the capacity one was using to choose it was significantly degraded, was a form of moral and intellectual courage that the wartime military vocabulary did not have adequate language for. The conventional vocabulary of battlefield courage addressed fear, physical danger, and self-sacrifice. It said almost nothing about the specific difficulty of commanding a company across a defended river at 4 in the morning when the officer doing so had been awake for 32 hours and knew clearly enough to be frightened by the knowledge that his ability to account for all relevant variables was compromised. The decision had to be made anyway, because the men waiting in the darkness required it. And because the alternative, acknowledging incapacity and passing the decision upward, was not always available and would, if routinely practiced, have paralyzed the entire command structure. Men made those decisions under those conditions, thousands of times across 6 years. The ones that turned out badly are scattered through the operational histories under headings that describe the outcome rather than the physiological state of the person who produced it. The ones that turned out well are scattered there too, without any notation of what it cost the person who made them to make them at all. Fact number 68. The formal military concept of rest, the institutional provision of periods in which soldiers were theoretically released from operational requirements and allowed to recover, was, in the experience of most frontline soldiers, a category that contained an enormous range of actual experiences, many of which bore little practical relationship to physiological recovery. A battalion in the Corps Reserve might be in range of long-range artillery. A unit nominally resting behind the line might be engaged in the heavy physical labor of building fortifications or improving roads. A soldier on leave in a rear area city might be spending the leave period in an environment whose noise, activity, and social demands prevented the deep, sustained sleep that genuine recovery required. The military's institutional concept of rest was defined by a reduced operational requirement rather than by the specific conditions of environment, duration, and continuity that the physiology of sleep recovery actually needs. The gap between the institution's definition and the physiology's requirements was one that the wartime military medical system noted without ever fully closing, and it contributed to the progressive exhaustion accumulation that characterized extended campaigns in all theaters. A man who had been officially rested but physiologically not restored was, from the perspective of the next operation that required him to function, simply a man who had a different recent history but the same functional deficit. Fact number 69. One of the lasting intellectual legacies of the Second World War's sustained encounter with human exhaustion was the transformation it produced in military medical thinking about the relationship between physical and psychological functioning. Before the war, the dominant framework treated physical and psychological health as essentially independent domains, with psychological breakdown under stress interpreted primarily through the lens of individual character rather than physiological mechanism. The war's evidence, the sheer scale of combat exhaustion casualties, the consistent finding that men of proven character and demonstrated courage broke under sufficient cumulative load, and the equally consistent finding that brief, simple physiological interventions produced rapid recovery in a significant proportion of cases, provided the empirical foundation for a different framework. Sleep deprivation was a cause of psychological deterioration, not merely a context for pre-existing weakness. Food, warmth, and rest were treatments for psychiatric casualties, not merely comforts for hypochondriacs. The psychological consequences of sustained physical depletion were as real as the physical ones, and as amenable to physical intervention. These conclusions, drawn from the wartime medical literature by figures like Swank, Grinker, Spiegel, and the contributors to the Army's official medical histories, represented a genuine conceptual shift whose influence on subsequent military psychiatry, occupational health, and eventually civilian sleep medicine was substantial and lasting. Fact number 70. The post-war generation raised by veterans of the Second World War absorbed, through the behavior and household culture of their parents, something of the wartime relationship with exhaustion and rest, though the transmission was largely unspoken and its wartime origins rarely acknowledged. Children raised by veterans recalled, in oral histories collected from the 1970s onward, specific household norms that distinguished their families from those of non-veteran parents, a directness about physical fatigue and its management, a practical rather than dramatic approach to going without sleep when circumstances required, an absence of the peacetime luxury of treating tiredness as an excuse or a complaint. Fathers who had learned to sleep in foxholes slept in armchairs and on trains and on the floors of waiting rooms without embarrassment, and this ease with the stolen rest, the soldier's relationship with available sleep as a resource to be used whenever the opportunity arose, was observed and absorbed by children who grew up seeing it as simply how adults managed tiredness. The wartime generation did not, on the whole, talk to its children about what it had experienced, but the habits it had acquired were visible, and the children who watched them were learning something about the relationship between need and resourcefulness that the generation that had forged the habits would not have described in those terms, but that they demonstrated daily in the way they lived. Fact number 71. The Afine the One. Intersection of racial segregation and exhaustion management in the United States Army produced a specific injustice that has been examined in the context of the broader history of African American service in WWII, but that has not been specifically analyzed in terms of its effect on the exhaustion management of black soldiers. African American units, operating under the constraints of a segregated military, were in many cases assigned to labor-intensive support roles, port operations, road construction, supply transport, that were physically demanding in ways that combat service was not continuously demanding, but which offered none of the adaptive mechanisms through which combat soldiers managed their exhaustion, the unit cohesion built by shared danger, the forward psychiatry system designed for combat units, the rotation policies that, imperfect as they were, at least existed as institutional acknowledgments that sustained operational tempo produced exhaustion requiring management. The men driving Red Bull Express trucks across France in the autumn of 1944, a predominantly black formation, operating trucks around the clock in a schedule that allowed minimal sleep, sustaining an operation whose supply implications were critical to the success of the entire Allied advance, were managing a form of sustained exhaustion in a system that had designed its welfare provisions for a different kind of service. The exhaustion management needs of these men were the same as those of the infantry they were supplying. The institutional provision for meeting those needs was not. Fact number 72. A question of what it meant to come home from the war and find that the exhaustion had followed, that the habits, the reflexes and the physiological alterations of years of sustained depletion had not simply dissolved with the signing of the armistice, was one that millions of veterans, confronted in the late 1940s and 1950s without any adequate conceptual or institutional framework for understanding what they were dealing with. A man who woke at 3 in the morning and could not return to sleep was not, in the vocabulary of the period, experiencing the long-term effects of sustained wartime sleep deprivation. He was, in the only vocabulary available, restless or troubled or having difficulties adjusting. A man who found that he could perform at extraordinarily high levels of physical effort for extended periods without what civilians described as tiredness, but who crashed without warning at unpredictable intervals into states of exhaustion that no amount of normal rest seemed to resolve, was not someone that any post-war welfare system knew how to help. The gap between the physiological reality that these men were inhabiting and the conceptual vocabulary available for describing it was one of the defining inadequacies of the post-war welfare response to the generation that had served, a gap that narrowed, slowly and incompletely, across the second half of the 20th century, but that was never fully closed before the last of the men who had lived inside it were gone. Fact number 73. The submarine sleep systems developed by the German Kriegsmarine and studied with interest by Allied naval intelligence illustrate the degree to which the management of exhaustion in operational conditions had become, by the middle of the war, a subject of genuine institutional attention across multiple armed forces. U-boat commanders, operating crews of between 45 and 60 men in vessels with sleeping berths for perhaps a third of that number, developed rotation systems that were necessarily far more sophisticated than their surface navy equivalents. Bunks were hot-bunked, occupied in rotation by men on different watch schedules, so that the same physical bunk was in almost continuous use by different men across the 24-hour day. The thermal residue of the previous occupant was a detail that U-boat crew members mentioned in memoirs with a particular intimacy. The warmth of a body not yet gone from a bunk you were about to inhabit was in the cold and wet of an Atlantic patrol, one of the most concretely human details of a profoundly dehumanizing experience. The sleep obtained in that bunk, brief, contingent, subject to interruption by depth charges and crash dives, was nonetheless real sleep. And it was managed with a practical ingenuity whose institutional codification represents one of the more interesting minor chapters in the history of wartime fatigue management. Fact number 74. The role that dreams played in the wartime soldier's relationship with exhaustion has been almost entirely overlooked in the historical literature, perhaps because the content of soldiers' dreams, recorded in a small number of diaries and mentioned occasionally in letters that passed the censor, was sufficiently disturbing that neither the dreamers nor the recipients typically invited further inquiry. What the available evidence suggests is that the dreams of the severely sleep-deprived combat soldier, when sleep finally came, were qualitatively more intense, more vivid, and more emotionally saturated than ordinary peacetime dreaming, in ways consistent with the known neurological dynamics of sleep-deprived REM rebound. When the brain has been denied REM sleep for extended periods and finally accesses it, it does so with unusual intensity, producing dreams that veterans described as more real than waking, populated by people and places whose detail exceeded anything that normal dreaming offered. The effective content of these dreams was typically unpleasant. Fear, loss, and the specific emotional residue of witnessed violence appeared in them with a fidelity that waking consciousness had sometimes managed to suppress, but the restorative quality of the sleep they accompanied was real. Several veterans described their most vivid wartime dreams as among the most memorable experiences of their lives precisely because of the quality of consciousness they represented. The exhausted brain finally given what it needed, running at a depth and intensity that wakefulness under those conditions never permitted. Fact number 75. The Medical Corps discovered, fairly early in the European campaign, that the most reliable single predictor of whether a combat exhaustion case would return to functional duty after treatment was not the severity of the presenting symptoms, not the nature of the precipitating incident, and not the soldier's pre-service psychiatric history. It was whether or not he believed himself capable of recovery. Men who arrived at forward treatment stations with the conviction, clear-eyed and undefended, neither falsely optimistic nor dramatically resigned, that they were temporarily depleted and would, given the intervention being offered, recover sufficiently to function again, showed return-to-duty rates significantly higher than men who had concluded that something fundamental and irreversible had occurred. The clinical implication, that the authoritative provision of this belief, where the patient did not spontaneously possess it, was a legitimate and effective medical intervention, was one of the practical foundations of forward psychiatry's approach. The examining psychiatrist or medical officer who told a man, with genuine conviction and appropriate authority, that he was suffering from a normal physiological response to abnormal conditions, that the treatment being offered was adequate, and that recovery was the expected outcome, was not providing reassurance in the ordinary colloquial sense. He was providing a specific cognitive input whose effect on the trajectory of the man's condition was, by the evidence available, real and substantial. Fact number 76. Among the adaptations that combat veterans carried into civilian life, one of the most enduring and most practically visible was a transformed relationship with the management of the immediate physical environment, a habit of continuous, low-level environmental optimization for sleep and rest that expressed the soldier's learned understanding of those conditions as resources to be actively managed rather than passively awaited. Veterans were observed by family members and colleagues to assess new environments almost immediately for their rest potential. The angle of light through a window that could be managed with a curtain, the temperature of a room that could be adjusted before settling to sleep, the position of a chair that allowed the maximum possible support for a brief rest at an unlikely hour. These assessments were performed automatically, without apparent deliberation, in the way that acquired skills manifest themselves, the way an experienced driver checks mirrors and blind spots without deciding to, the way an experienced cook tastes a sauce and adjusts before consciously formulating a judgment about what it needs. The skill was not dramatic or obviously militaristic. It looked, from the outside, simply like practical attention to comfort. Only the veterans themselves, when asked, could identify its origin. The years during which rest had been scarce enough to require management, and during which the management of it, the finding of it in unlikely circumstances, the protection of it once found, the calibration of its depth to the available time, had been a survival skill that the body had never quite forgotten. Fact number 77. The wartime soldier's encounter with the limits of human functioning under exhaustion was, for many of the men who experienced it, a permanent transformation of their understanding of what a human being was capable of. The discovery came not from an expansion of what seemed possible, but from the compression of what seemed necessary. The gradual revelation, over weeks and months of sustained operations, that the body and mind required far less than peacetime had suggested in order to continue functioning, and that the experience of functioning on far less was uncomfortable and degrading and permanently marked by the knowledge of what it cost, but that it was possible. This knowledge, held in the body as much as in the mind, embedded in the reflexes and habits and automatic responses of a generation that had tested itself against genuine extremity, was not a comfortable legacy. It came paired with the knowledge of the cost, the understanding of what sustained depletion did to a person and to the people around them, the recognition that the capacity to endure was not the same as the absence of damage, but it was real knowledge, acquired at a real price. And it produced a generation whose relationship with hardship was genuinely different from that of both their parents and their children, a generation that knew from the inside that the edge was further out than anyone in peacetime had reason to believe, and that the knowledge of its location, however acquired, was knowledge that changed the person who possessed it. Fact number 78. The specific exhaustion of the military chaplain under sustained operational conditions had a particular quality that arose from the intersection of physical depletion with the specific emotional and spiritual demands of the role. A chaplain serving with an infantry battalion in sustained contact was subject to all the same sleep deprivation and physical depletion as the men he served, with the additional requirement that he remain at the moment of pastoral contact genuinely present in a way that the exhaustion-driven emotional withdrawal that protected other soldiers was specifically unavailable to him. A man whose role required him to sit with the dying, to speak with the grieving, to provide the human presence that made an individual death something more than a statistical event. This man could not protect himself with the numbing that exhaustion eventually produced in combat soldiers, because the numbing would have destroyed the quality of presence that constituted his only available contribution. Several chaplains' unpublished diaries from the wartime period describe this specific impossibility with a directness that their more measured professional communications concealed. The effort, daily renewed from depleted resources, of being genuinely available to others from a position that had less of itself to offer with each successive day. Fact number 79. The specific form of exhaustion experienced by women who served in auxiliary territorial service and Women's Army Corps roles that brought them into proximity with forward operations. The women who served as plotters in RAF Fighter Command operations rooms during the Battle of Britain, as signals operators and intelligence analysts in forward headquarters throughout the war, and as drivers and dispatch riders in both theaters, has been systematically overlooked in the exhaustion literature. These women worked shift patterns as demanding as those of the men whose operations they supported, in working environments whose emotional intensity was in no way inferior to what the men experienced. The plotter who moved counters on a table in a Battle of Britain operations room was processing the same information in the same conditions of extreme operational tempo and existential stakes as the controller whose decisions she was enabling. The specific adaptation of maintaining functional precision under sustained exhaustion, the same adaptation that has been the subject of this entire series, was required of these women as fully and as continuously as it was required of the men they served, and was acquired at the same physiological cost. The literature's failure to examine their experience in these terms is a specific lacuna in the history of wartime exhaustion, and it reflects assumptions about what counts as operational service that the evidence from these women's actual work does not support. Fact number 80. The exhaustion of the final months of the war in Europe, specifically the spring of 1945, when the Allied advance into Germany was proceeding rapidly and the end was clearly in sight, had a specific psychological character that differentiated it from the exhaustion of earlier phases and that made it in some respects more psychologically dangerous rather than less. The proximity of the end, near enough to be felt, near enough for specific men in specific engagements to calculate what the probability of surviving the remaining time actually was, invested each day's continued exposure to danger with a specific, acute quality that the earlier, indeterminate phases of the war had not produced. Veterans described the spring of 1945 in multiple accounts as among the most frightening periods of their service, not because the danger was objectively greater but because the cost of dying had become with the end so close, more specifically painful to contemplate. Men who had functioned through years of the war found the last weeks among the hardest. The specific reason was the proximity of the end that made not reaching it feel, for the first time, like a precise and individual tragedy rather than an abstract statistical possibility. Fact number 81. The precise moment at which combat exhaustion transitioned from a manageable adaptive state to a medical emergency was one that wartime medical officers described with more consistency than might have been expected from a clinical entity that had no agreed diagnostic criteria and was being assessed under field conditions without testing equipment. The transition was marked in most accounts not by the appearance of a specific new symptom but by the crossing of a quality threshold in the presentation of symptoms that were already present. The tremor that had been intermittent became continuous. The startle response that had been exaggerated became uncontrollable. The emotional flatness that had been protective withdrawal became an inability to respond to anything, including direct commands. The experienced medical officer or NCO who recognized this transition was recognizing something that could not be measured precisely but was clearly visible, and whose recognition had direct operational consequences. Getting that recognition right, the specific clinical judgment of where on the continuum between adaptive functioning and clinical collapse a specific individual currently stood, was one of the most important medical skills of the entire war. And it was performed daily, in imperfect conditions by people who had largely taught themselves to perform it. Fact number 82. The Red Army's management of exhaustion during the sustained offensive operations of 1944 and 1945, the great drives westward that reconquered Soviet territory and carried the war into Germany, produced operational feats of sustained functioning that Western military historians have tended to attribute to manpower abundance without examining the exhaustion management practices that made the tempo possible. Soviet operational doctrine in the war's later stages relied on deep penetration operations that required leading formations to advance continuously across distances and at speeds that left logistical support struggling to keep pace, maintaining offensive pressure by accepting levels of soldier exhaustion that Allied doctrine would have identified as operationally unsustainable. The men who executed these operations were functioning, toward the end of the large offensive drives, in physiological states that Western medical assessments would have classified as requiring immediate rest and treatment. They did not receive rest and treatment. They received operational objectives, and they met them at a physiological cost that expressed itself in the enormous Soviet losses of those final campaigns. Whether this represents a different understanding of the limits of human functioning, a different institutional willingness to consume those limits, or simply the specific weight of a war that had already killed so many that the boundaries of sacrifice had been permanently redrawn, is a question that the operational histories answer in aggregate without fully addressing at the level of the individual soldier. Fact number 83. The wartime experience of sustained functioning under exhaustion left its clearest long-term cultural mark, not in the institutions that tried to manage it, the forward psychiatry units, the rotation policies, the welfare programs, but in the private adaptations that veterans carried into their post-war lives and transmitted, without necessarily understanding the transmission, to the generations that followed. The mid-20th century's institutional culture of endurance, its relative ease with long working hours, its tendency to interpret complaints about fatigue as weakness, its specific cultural prestige attached to the ability to function effectively on little rest, was not purely a product of wartime experience, but it was significantly shaped by a generation for whom the ability to function under exhaustion had been a survival requirement, and who had built their post-war personal and professional identities partly on the capacity that the war had demonstrated they possessed. The post-war workplaces, normalization of overwork, and the post-war culture's comparative comfort with personal depletion owe something, though it is impossible to quantify precisely how much, to the fact that the people who built those workplaces and shaped that culture had spent years discovering, at genuine cost, that the human body and mind could be driven far past the thresholds that peacetime comfort had suggested were their limits. That knowledge, once acquired, does not leave quietly. It shapes the expectations one holds, the demands one makes, and the standards one applies, to oneself and eventually, without always intending to others. Fact number 84. The distinction between the exhaustion of men who believed in the outcome of the war, who had, however abstractly, a sense of why the sustained depletion was being incurred, and the exhaustion of men who had lost that belief, or who had never strongly held it, was observed by wartime military psychiatrists without being fully theorized. Roy Grinker and John Spiegel, in their landmark 1945 work Men Under Stress, noted that the maintenance of a meaningful context for suffering, an answer to the question of what the suffering was for, was among the strongest available protections against the psychiatric breakdown that sustained exhaustion and fear produced. This was not a simple finding about ideology or patriotism. Men in combat who were least likely to break were often not the most explicitly patriotic or the most ideologically committed, but rather those who had found a local, personal meaning for their continued functioning, the loyalty to their companions, the specific obligation to the man next to them, the immediate and concrete purpose of keeping someone they cared about alive. The meaning required did not need to be large or historically significant. It needed only to be genuine and immediate enough to answer, at the moment of maximum depletion, the question of why this particular step was worth taking. The men who could answer that question, from whatever source the answer came, were the men who took the step, and then another, for as long as it continued to be necessary. Fact number 85. As the series approaches its conclusion, one fact stands above the others in its simplicity and its weight. The men and women who learned to function while exhausted during the Second World War did not think of themselves as performing an extraordinary human feat. They thought of themselves as doing what needed to be done, in conditions they had not chosen and could not change. For as long as those conditions persisted, the extraordinary was their ordinary. The limit they had found, and had kept functioning beyond, was simply the terrain they inhabited. And when the war ended, and they returned to the peacetime world that had been waiting for them, they did not, on the whole, talk about it, not because it had not mattered, but because the vocabulary for it did not exist, and because the peacetime world, with its comfortable distances from anything that had required this much, was not a place in which the experience translated easily into language. What they carried was not silence exactly. It was the particular reserve of people who know something about the human body and the human mind that they have no clean way of saying, and who have learned through 6 years of practicing it, that the knowing is in the doing rather than the saying. They knew what they had been capable of. They knew what it had cost. They put it somewhere, and they got on with it, and the world they built on the other side of the war was built by people who were carrying that knowledge in every bone, whether anyone asked them about it or not. Fact number 86. The physical marks that sustained exhaustion left on the bodies of wartime soldiers were sometimes visible enough that they served as informal evidence of the intensity of a man's service in a way that no medal or citation captured as directly. Photographs of infantrymen after extended operations, after Okinawa, after the Ardennes, after Monte Cassino, show faces that belong by their physiological markers to men significantly older than their chronological age. The specific dermal changes associated with sustained stress hormone exposure, the muscle mass loss that accompanies weeks of caloric deficit and physical depletion, the postural changes of men whose bodies have been spending reserves rather than building them for months. Veterans who returned from extended Pacific service noted, in accounts recorded decades later, that they weighed significantly less than they had on enlistment. Losses of 15 to 20 pounds were common, with some men losing considerably more. The restoration of normal weight, when food became available, occurred over a period of months rather than weeks, as if the body required time to believe that the scarcity had genuinely ended. These physical marks were the legible record of what the invisible functioning had cost, the measurable consequence of the sustained expenditure of physiological resources that had kept a man upright and moving, and deciding when everything in his biology was attempting to require him to stop. Fact number 87. The specific cognitive trait that military psychologists found most reliably correlated with effective functioning under sustained exhaustion was not intelligence, not physical fitness, not pre-war occupational success, and not any of the character traits that the military's selection processes were designed to measure. It was rather a quality that different researchers described in slightly different terms: tolerance for ambiguity in one formulation, comfort with uncertainty in another, the ability to act under incomplete information in a third, but that referred to essentially the same underlying disposition, the capacity to continue functioning effectively in situations whose outcome was genuinely unknown, and whose relevant variables were partially or wholly inaccessible to assessment. Under conditions of sustained exhaustion, the quality of available information about any given situation is degraded, perception is less reliable, memory is less accurate, reasoning is slower and more error-prone. The person who requires high-quality information before acting is, in those conditions, likely to be paralyzed or extremely slow. The person who is comfortable making a good enough decision from incomplete information, and who can then remain adaptive as new information arrives, is the person whose functioning best survives the degradation that exhaustion imposes. This trait turned out to be one of the most operationally valuable characteristics a soldier could possess, and its identification as such was one of the more important legacies of wartime exhaustion research. Fact number 88. The exhaustion of the last days of combat, the specific experience of the final hours before a ceasefire, when the knowledge that the end was imminent coexisted with the unchanged requirement to maintain the vigilance that had sustained life across the entire preceding period, was described by veterans with an almost unanimous quality of suspended unreality. The body that had been functioning for years on the specific assumption that the next moment might require everything it had left, could not immediately recalibrate that assumption to the knowledge that the next moment would not actually require anything of the kind. Veterans described the hours immediately following the German and Japanese surrenders in terms that returned, repeatedly, to one specific physiological observation: they could not stop scanning. The trained alertness that had been their survival mechanism, the continuous environmental monitoring, the involuntary attention to sound and movement, and the interpretation of shadow, continued to operate in the minutes and hours after the shooting stopped, as if the nervous system had not yet received the notification that it was no longer required. Some veterans described this persistence of vigilance lasting for days after the formal cessation of hostilities. Others described it lasting for years. A few described it as never entirely ceasing. The body that had learned to function under exhaustion in the service of survival had also, it transpired, learned to remain permanently ready in case the survival requirement returned. It was a form of competence that its owners would have gladly surrendered, and that a significant number of them carried, involuntarily, for the rest of their lives. Fact number 89. The generation that learned to function while exhausted during the Second World War passed certain things on to its children without explaining what was being passed or why. The ease with early rising, the lack of drama around tiredness, the specific household norm that fatigue was a condition to be managed rather than indulged, acknowledged privately rather than broadcast publicly, addressed practically rather than emotionally. Children raised in these households learned from the behavioral example of parents who had for years operated in conditions where complaint about tiredness served no function, and where the management of its effects was simply a daily necessity. They learned without understanding that the model of management they were absorbing had been forged under pressures their parents would not describe, and that the peacetime household bore no obvious resemblance to. The transmission happened anyway, in the watching of a father who came home from a long day's work and ate and helped with the washing up and sat for an hour without specifically resting before going to bed, in the observing of a mother who had been on her feet since 6 and who did not comment on it, in the gradual accumulation of the understanding that the body was a tool that required maintenance but did not require particular attention beyond that. Whether this was wisdom or repression or simply the specific cultural idiom of a generation that had been required to get on with things and had gotten on with them, is a question that the generation receiving the transmission was, for a long time, not equipped to answer because it had been given the habits without the history. Fact number 90. The relationship between unit identity, the specific pride and self-understanding of belonging to a particular formation with a particular history and reputation, and the management of exhaustion was observed by wartime commanders and military social researchers with sufficient consistency to suggest a genuine mechanism rather than mere coincidence. Units with strong regimental or divisional identities, the 1st Marine Division in the Pacific, the Guards Brigades in North Africa and Italy, the Red Army's Guards formations in the East, showed lower rates of exhaustion-related breakdown, all other things being equal, than comparable units without that specific institutional pride. The mechanism was not simply morale in the generic sense, it was the specific function of identity as a resource. A man who understood himself as a member of a unit with a specific tradition and reputation had access to that understanding as a supplement to his own depleted individual motivation. When his personal reserves were insufficient to sustain continued functioning, the identity of the unit, the sense that men of this unit did not stop, that the tradition required it, that the person who stopped was not merely failing himself but failing a collective that extended backward in time and forward into obligation, could supply an additional margin. Whether the margin was technically real or purely psychological is, from the perspective of the man who used it to take one more step, a distinction without a practical difference. Fact number 91. The specific problem of maintaining accurate memory under sustained exhaustion, the fact that chronically sleep-deprived individuals show measurable deficits in both the encoding of new information and the reliable retrieval of previously stored information, had operational consequences that the wartime military could observe without yet having the neuroscientific framework to explain. After-action reviews consistently found that soldiers reporting combat experiences within 24 to 48 hours of an engagement gave significantly more fragmented, less temporally coherent, and more internally inconsistent accounts than soldiers reporting the same engagements after a period of adequate sleep. The practical implication, that immediate debriefs conducted before men had slept produced less reliable information than debriefs conducted after rest, was not acted on systematically because the operational need for immediate intelligence typically outweighed the evidential quality argument for delayed debriefing. The theoretical implication that a significant proportion of the wartime record, including after-action reports, war diaries, and the immediate accounts on which operational histories were subsequently based, was produced by profoundly sleep-deprived individuals whose memory encoding and retrieval were measurably impaired, is one that the historians who rely on those documents might usefully bear in mind. The wartime record is not only incomplete, in some of its most immediate and apparently authoritative sections, it was produced under conditions that modern cognitive science would identify as specifically hostile to accurate recall. Fact number 92. The question of what specifically allowed certain soldiers to maintain not just physical functioning but genuine moral functioning, the capacity for ethical judgment, for compassion, for the recognition of the humanity of others, under conditions of profound exhaustion has occupied the historians and psychologists who have studied wartime atrocity as much as those who have studied wartime courage. The evidence from both directions suggests the same finding: sustained exhaustion, combined with sustained exposure to violence and the gradual erosion of the moral protections of distance and normalcy, produced conditions in which the capacity for ethical functioning was significantly reduced. The wartime atrocity record, the documented instances of unnecessary killing, of abuse of prisoners, of treatment of civilians that violated the norms soldiers had entered the war carrying, is not comprehensible solely in terms of character, ideology, or command permissiveness. Exhaustion is one of the variables. It does not excuse what it contributed to, but an account of wartime behavior that omits it is an account that attributes to deliberate choice certain things that were partially the product of the degradation of the neural systems that deliberate choice requires. The honest history of what exhaustion does to people includes this: uncomfortably, necessarily, and with the clear understanding that what exhaustion makes more possible is not thereby made acceptable. Fact number 93. The wartime research on exhaustion and human performance contributed, across the following decades, to developments in fields far removed from military medicine: occupational health, shift work regulation, long-haul aviation crew rest requirements, medical resident working hours, and eventually the consumer sleep science industry of the early 21st century. The specific findings that proved most influential were the dose-response relationships between sleep deprivation and cognitive performance, documented in enough wartime and immediate post-war military research to provide the empirical foundation for subsequent laboratory studies. The finding that subjective alertness diverged systematically from objective performance under prolonged sleep deprivation, with people consistently overestimating their own functioning as it deteriorated, and the finding about individual variation in exhaustion resilience that was subsequently attributed, through genetic and neurological research, to variation in the adenosine and circadian systems that regulate sleep pressure. None of these findings were fully available to the wartime military. They emerged from the wartime military's encounter with the problem of human exhaustion as a massive, uncontrolled experiment in human functional limits, an experiment that no ethics board would have permitted, and that produced, at enormous human cost, a body of evidence whose applications eventually reached far beyond the military context that had generated it. Fact number 94. The specifically acoustic dimension of wartime exhaustion, the role that hearing and the interpretation of sound played in the management of fatigue, is one of the sensory aspects of the experience that verbal accounts capture most vividly. In a combat environment, sound frequently carried more reliable tactical information than vision, particularly in darkness, in dense vegetation, or in smoke. The exhausted soldier's relationship with sound was therefore a matter of operational significance. The specific degradation that sleep deprivation produced in the auditory system's ability to accurately locate, identify, and categorize sounds in a noisy environment had direct consequences for survival. Veterans described this degradation with precision. Familiar sounds that had once been immediately and automatically categorized: the specific crack of a rifle, the specific thump of artillery, the specific pitch of an aircraft engine, became, under sustained exhaustion, objects of slower and less reliable interpretation, requiring explicit cognitive processing that had previously been unnecessary. The practical implication was a specific form of tactical vulnerability. The exhausted soldier was not deaf, but he was slower, and in environments where the relevant sound was often followed almost immediately by the event it signaled, the additional processing time that exhaustion imposed was sometimes the margin between a warning acted on and a warning arrived at too late. Fact number 95. The veterans of the Second World War who lived into old age and who were eventually interviewed by oral historians, family members, and journalists about their wartime experiences showed, with remarkable consistency, a specific cognitive pattern when asked about exhaustion. They minimized it, not because the experience was not real. Their accounts of it, when it emerged, were vivid and detailed, but because the cultural norm of the generation was that the management of hardship was not an appropriate subject for extended discussion, and because the comparative frame they applied to their own experience was always the experience of those who had suffered more, not less. A man who had spent 8 weeks in the line with 4 hours of sleep a night consistently evaluated his experience in the context of the man who had been in the line for 6 months, or who had been a prisoner, or who had not come home at all. This comparative minimization meant that the sustained and genuinely extraordinary experience of functioning while exhausted, The daily adaptive achievement this series has attempted to document was consistently underdescribed by the people who had performed it. In the vocabulary of "it wasn't that bad, and others had it much harder, and you just got on with it." They were right that others had it harder. They were also performing, in that minimization, the same fundamental act that had characterized their wartime experience, the placement of individual need below a threshold that required it to be managed rather than announced. Fact number 96. The physical competence that soldiers acquired through months of functioning under exhaustion, the specific, refined mechanical efficiency of a body that had learned to move, maintain, and deploy itself with minimal expenditure of resources, was described by veterans as one of the most purely functional legacies of their service, and one of the least romanticized. A man who had learned to dig a foxhole quickly and correctly the first time, because he might not get a second opportunity, had acquired a physical competence that expressed itself as economy rather than effort, the right tool, the right motion, the minimum time required. A man who had learned to navigate in darkness across unfamiliar terrain because the alternative was becoming lost in a situation where being lost was potentially fatal, had acquired a spatial intelligence that expressed itself in a calm, systematic attention to environmental information that sighted, rested people often found puzzling in its apparent effortlessness. These competences were not the heroic physical qualities that wartime mythology tended to celebrate. They were the mundane physical intelligence of people who had been required to be good at things that mattered, and had become good at them, and who brought that specific quality of practical mastery into the post-war world where it expressed itself, quietly and without fanfare, in the way they approached any task that required them to do something efficiently and well. Fact number 97. The question of why some soldiers' experience of sustained exhaustion produced in the aftermath a permanent alteration of their relationship with rest, a lasting inability to sleep deeply, or to allow themselves rest without guilt, or to disengage the vigilance systems that wartime had activated, while others recovered what appeared to be a normal peacetime relationship with sleep and rest, is one that the psychology of the period could not answer, and that subsequent research has only partially resolved. The variable that appears most consistently in the available evidence is the degree to which the wartime exhaustion experience had been processed, in the narrative sense of being organized into a coherent story with a beginning, middle, and recognizable end, versus remaining as unorganized sensory and emotional material that the nervous system continued to respond to as unresolved threat. The veterans who talked about their experience, who found words for it, in whatever context and to whatever audience, showed, on the available evidence, somewhat better long-term outcomes than those who did not. The causal direction of this relationship is not entirely clear. It may be that men who processed the experience verbally recovered better because processing helps, or that men who recovered better were more able to process verbally because processing requires emotional resources that the unrecovered cannot access. Probably both are true, in a recursion that is characteristically human in its refusal to yield to clean analysis. Fact number 98. Among the legacies of wartime exhaustion research that have most directly shaped the contemporary world, one of the most practically significant and least publicly acknowledged is the influence of military findings on the regulation of civilian working hours in safety-critical industries. The evidence that sustained sleep deprivation produced predictable, measurable degradation in complex cognitive performance, evidence accumulated from wartime research and subsequently confirmed in post-war laboratory studies, became in the 1970s and 1980s the empirical foundation for regulatory challenges to the working hours norms of aviation crews, long-haul truckers, medical residents, and nuclear plant operators. The specific regulatory frameworks that now govern rest requirements in those industries, the FAA's flight crew rest regulations, the European Working Time Directive's provisions for rest, the reforms to medical resident working hours that followed the Libby Zion case in the United States, trace their empirical ancestry through a chain of research citations that runs back through the post-war decades to studies conducted in military contexts during and immediately after the Second World War. The soldier who could not maintain accurate fire control after 36 hours of wakefulness is in this sense the ancestor of the regulation that requires an airline pilot to have had a certain number of hours of rest before commanding a commercial flight. The connection is not romantic, it is empirical, and it has saved lives. Fact number 99. The specific quality of the silence that fell over many veterans when asked directly about their experience of exhaustion and its management, not the silence of people who cannot remember, but the silence of people who are deciding in the moment whether the memory is worth the effort of translation, was one that the oral historians and family members who conducted those conversations over the post-war decades came to recognize as a specific communicative act. It was the silence of a man calculating whether what he knew could be said in a way that the person asking would recognize as true, whether the vocabulary of civilian peacetime experience contained the concepts required to convey what sustained functioning at the margin of human capacity had actually been like. In most cases, it concluded with a decision that the vocabulary did not contain those concepts, and that the effort of constructing them from available materials was not worth the result it would produce. An approximation that would be accepted as understanding but would not be understanding. What the veterans understood about exhaustion, its specific quality, its specific demands, its specific cost, and the specific improbable fact of continuing to function within it, was something they had learned in a school that only the experience itself could constitute, and from which no transcript could be issued to those who had not attended. Fact number 100. The last daily act that many combat soldiers performed before attempting sleep, in a foxhole, in a barn, in a ditch, in the brief safety of a position that might not be safe in an hour, was a check of their immediate environment whose purpose was less tactical than it was psychological, the confirmation that whatever could be confirmed had been confirmed. Weapon accessible, companion present, emergency plan rehearsed. The inventory was brief, sometimes 20 seconds, sometimes less, and then it was done, and the available rest was what remained. This small act of closure, the acknowledgement that tonight's preparation was complete, that the available margin of safety had been established as far as it could be established, and that what could not be controlled could not be controlled, was the soldier's daily peace treaty with uncertainty, not a resolution of it, not a pretense that it did not exist, but a practical agreement that the terms of the current situation had been met as completely as the available resources permitted, and that what came next was outside the scope of further management. It was the last act of functioning before the attempt to rest. It was performed in conditions that no sleep science would identify as adequate for rest. And then, because the alternative was to remain awake indefinitely in a condition that was already beyond the sustainable, the exhausted person closed his eyes and offered what was left of his consciousness to whatever the next few hours would or would not contain. Fact number 101. The soldier who woke on the morning of the 8th of May 1945, or the 2nd of September 1945, and understood that the war was over did not immediately cease to be the person that the war had made him. The habits of exhaustion management, the light sleep, the environmental scanning, the narrowed horizon, the specific economy of motion and emotion that sustained depletion had trained into him across years of frontline service, did not dissolve with the signature on the surrender document. They were present, in the body that woke that morning, as completely as they had been the day before. What had changed was only the requirement, the specific, survival-grade necessity that had forged those habits in the first place had been removed. The habits remained, in a body that had learned them too thoroughly to release them immediately, and in some cases too thoroughly to release them ever entirely. The man who rose that morning and performed the automatic check of his immediate environment before allowing himself to be fully awake, and who then noticed that he was performing the check, and who understood for the first time in years that the check was no longer necessary, and who did not know in that specific moment what performing the check meant now, or what he was now, or what kind of morning this was going to turn out to be. This man was carrying in his body the complete record of what it had cost to function, daily, through the years that had produced the morning in which he now stood. He had no language for it. He had no one to give it to. He got up, and he went on, and the morning continued, as mornings do. The 101 facts in this series have traced a single subject from its individual physiological roots to its collective historical consequences. The capacity of human beings to maintain functioning, to continue thinking, moving, deciding, caring, and performing, across conditions of sustained exhaustion that should by any reasonable clinical measure have precluded it. The subject is uncomfortable in the specific way that subjects are uncomfortable when they reveal something about human capacity that complicates the narratives we prefer. We prefer to believe that people function well because they are rested, fed, supported, and operating within their limits. The Second World War's systematic evidence is that people also function imperfectly, at cost, with consequences that appear in their bodies and minds long afterward, well outside those limits, when the alternative to functioning is worse than the functioning itself. The cost deserves to be named first, because the temptation to celebrate the capacity without acknowledging its price is a temptation that the historical literature has not always resisted. The cost was paid in the psychiatric casualties that exceeded 500,000 American servicemen alone, in the physiological deterioration that expressed itself in post-war health outcomes across every nation that had asked this of its people, in the specific damage to the sleep and rest systems of a generation that transmitted something of that damage, in attenuated but real form, to the children who grew up in households shaped by its effects. The cost was paid in the decisions made badly at 3 in the morning by men whose decision-making capacity was objectively compromised, in the friendly fire incidents attributable to exhaustion-degraded recognition systems, in the atrocities that exhaustion made more possible without making it inevitable. The price of the extraordinary functioning this series has described was real, was large, and was paid partly by the people who performed it, and partly by everyone who came within the radius of their impaired functioning. The capacity also deserves full acknowledgement, not because it is admirable in the abstract, but because understanding it accurately is prerequisite to understanding what the war actually was and what it required of the people who fought and lived through it. The soldier who maintained his weapons, held his position, kept his companions alive, and continued to make defensible decisions across days and weeks of inadequate sleep, was not, by doing so, demonstrating some exceptional personal virtue that distinguished him from the man who collapsed. He was demonstrating the resilience of the human organism under conditions that the organism had not been designed for and had not requested, sustained by the specific social bonds and institutional structures and informal coping mechanisms that this series has attempted to document. What he was capable of was not uniquely his. It was the capacity of the species, accessed under duress, at a price that the species paid collectively and that we are still in various ways accounting for. The informal knowledge that soldiers generated about the management of exhaustion, the sleeping techniques, the cognitive narrowing strategies, the mutual monitoring systems, the calibration of hope to achievable horizons, the use of humor and ritual and identity as supplements to depleted individual motivation, was among the most practically intelligent bodies of knowledge produced by the entire war. It was generated by people with no specialist training, under conditions of acute and sustained hardship, through the simple mechanism of collective empirical trial and the transmission of what worked to the people who needed it.